The drive to the cabin was long and exhausting. My friend Mark and I had planned this weekend trip months in advance, a short getaway from the stress of our everyday lives. The cabin was deep in the woods, isolated from any nearby town or civilization. The last stretch of road was barely a road at all, just a narrow dirt path cutting through thick trees. The only sign of human presence was an old, weathered wooden sign at the entrance to the property, barely readable through the moss and age. By the time we arrived, the sun was already beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin itself was small, rustic, and clearly old. It had a front porch with a creaky wooden swing and a single light above the door that flickered slightly when we turned it on. Inside, it was simple: 2 rooms, a fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a single bathroom. The air smelled of aged wood and dust, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. Mark dropped his bag on the floor and stretched his arms. "Feels like we just traveled back in time," he said, looking around. I nodded, setting my own bag near the couch. "At least it's quiet." We spent the next hour settling in, unpacking our food and supplies, lighting a fire in the fireplace, and making a quick meal. As night fully set in, the woods outside became completely silent. No birds, no insects, just an eerie stillness. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like something was watching. After eating, we played a few rounds of cards, talked about work, and enjoyed the peaceful solitude. Around 11 p.m., we decided to turn in. The cabin had 2 small beds in the back room, separated by a nightstand with a single oil lamp. We left the fireplace burning low, casting a dim orange glow through the doorway. I had just started dozing off when I heard it. A light, dragging sound against the wooden floor outside the cabin. My eyes snapped open. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but then I heard it again, slow, deliberate scraping, like something being dragged. I turned my head toward Mark's bed. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. He shifted under his blanket, but didn't respond. Then came the knock. 3 slow, steady knocks on the front door. Not loud, not frantic, just measured and deliberate. My body tensed. My mind raced through possibilities. Who would be knocking on our cabin this late at night? We were miles from anyone. There were no neighbors, no other visitors. I waited, holding my breath. Another knock. 3 taps, just like before. I sat up slowly, my heart pounding. "Mark." He groaned and turned over. "What?" "Someone's knocking." That woke him up instantly. He sat up, looking toward the darkened doorway leading to the front room. We both listened. Silence. "Maybe it's an animal," Mark whispered, but he didn't sound convinced. I shook my head. "Animals don't knock." I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack and clicked it on. The narrow beam cut through the darkness as I swung my legs over the side of the bed. Mark did the same, rubbing his face before standing up. Carefully, we stepped into the front room. The fire had burned lower, casting long, flickering shadows across the wooden walls. The front door was still closed. Another knock. 3 steady taps. I raised the flashlight and aimed it at the door. "Who's there?" I called out. No answer. Mark moved toward the window and pulled back the curtain slightly, peering outside. His face was tense. "See anything?" I whispered. He shook his head. "No one." I swallowed hard. If there was no one there, then who or what was knocking? After a long pause, I took a deep breath and reached for the doorknob. Slowly, I turned it and pulled the door open just a few inches. The cold night air rushed in, sending a shiver down my spine. I shined the flashlight through the small opening, sweeping the beam across the porch and into the darkness beyond. Nothing. The trees stood still, their twisted branches barely visible against the moonlight. The dirt path leading to the cabin was empty. I pushed the door open wider and stepped onto the porch. The wooden planks creaked under my weight. Mark followed close behind. We searched the entire perimeter of the cabin, checking behind the trees and scanning the forest with our flashlight. There were no footprints in the dirt except our own, no signs of movement. "Maybe it was just the wind," Mark muttered, though he didn't sound convinced. We stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing but silence. With no other explanation, we reluctantly went back inside, locking the door behind us. We returned to our beds, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. Every whisper of wind against the walls made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but I woke up again hours later. The fire had burned down to embers, leaving the cabin in near darkness. Then I heard it again. 3 knocks. Slow, steady. I held my breath, staring at the bedroom doorway. The room felt colder now, the air thick with unease. Mark shifted in his bed. "Are you hearing that?" "Yeah." We sat up again, listening. Then came a new sound, a faint creaking, as if weight was being shifted on the front porch. Like someone was standing there, waiting. Mark and I looked at each other. Neither of us wanted to check this time. Then something new. A sound so subtle, I almost thought I imagined it. The soft click of the doorknob turning. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it at the door. "Who's there?" I called again. No answer. The doorknob rattled once, then stopped. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window, pulling the curtain back. My breath caught in my throat. For the briefest moment, in the pale moonlight, I saw it. A figure, just beyond the porch, barely visible in the trees. No details, no features, just a tall, shadowy shape standing motionless in the darkness. Then, as if sensing my gaze, it moved. Not running, not walking, just drifting back into the trees, fading into the shadows until it disappeared completely. My stomach twisted. "Mark," I whispered. There was someone out there. Neither of us slept after that. We sat in the front room, watching the door, waiting for more sounds, more knocks. But nothing came. The figure never returned. By dawn, we were exhausted but relieved. As soon as the first light of morning broke through the trees, we packed our things and left. We never talked about it much after that, but I never forgot those knocks. Slow, deliberate, as if someone or something wanted to be let in. And the worst part, when we checked the porch before leaving, there were no footprints. Not a single mark in the dirt. Whoever knocked never left a trace. It was the middle of winter when we decided to rent a few cabins deep in the mountains for a weekend getaway. The idea was simple: escape from the noise of the city, relax in the quiet wilderness, and enjoy the snow-covered landscape. There were 6 of us in total, 3 men and 3 women, some close friends, others just acquaintances. The drive up was long, winding, and isolated. As we climbed higher into the mountains, the roads became narrower, the trees taller, and the air colder. Snow had been falling steadily all afternoon, and by the time we reached the cabins, a thick white layer covered everything. The sky was darkening, and the nearest sign of civilization was over an hour away. The cabins themselves were old but well-kept, scattered across a small clearing. They weren't modern. No electricity except for a backup generator, no cell service, and only a few wood-burning stoves for heat. The remoteness was part of the appeal, but as I looked around at the dense forest surrounding us, I couldn't shake the feeling of being completely cut off from the world. Inside, the cabins were cozy. We got a fire going, opened some drinks, and settled in. The atmosphere was warm, filled with laughter and conversation. The 6 of us sat around a wooden table, playing cards, sharing stories, and unwinding after the long trip. At some point during the night, one of the girls, Anna, pulled out a small bag and set it on the table. "Brought something fun for the weekend," she said with a grin. I immediately knew what she meant. Psychedelics. Mushrooms, to be exact. Most of the group was excited, but I wasn't sure. I'd never tried them before, and being so deep in the woods, miles away from help, made me nervous. Still, I didn't want to be the only one left out. After some convincing, I agreed to take a small amount. As the night went on, the effects settled in. The room felt warmer, the fire crackled louder, and the laughter echoed through the cabin. Everything felt connected, alive. At some point, Anna got up and put on her coat. "I want to go outside," she said, smiling. "The snow looks amazing." None of us thought much of it. We watched her step outside, leaving the door slightly open behind her. The cold air seeped in, but the warmth of the fire kept us comfortable. Minutes passed. Then more. "Where'd Anna go?" someone asked. We looked at each other. She had only planned to step outside for a moment, but it had been at least 10 minutes. One of the guys, James, got up and peeked out the door. "Anna," he called into the night. No response. He turned back to us, frowning. "She's not out here." At first, we weren't too worried. Maybe she had wandered off a little further than she meant to, enjoying the snow. Maybe she was standing just outside our view, lost in thought. We put on our coats and stepped outside, calling her name. The night was eerily quiet. The snowfall had stopped, and everything was still. The only sounds were our voices echoing through the trees. Anna was nowhere to be seen. Maybe she went to one of the other cabins? Sarah suggested. We checked. The other cabins were empty, untouched. The doors were locked. Now the unease started creeping in. We split up, circling the clearing, searching for footprints in the snow. We found them leading away from the cabin, but something was off. The tracks went in a straight line toward the woods, as if she had walked away with a purpose. No hesitation, no wandering. Just a direct path into the trees. She wouldn't just walk into the woods alone, Mark said, his breath visible in the cold air. But she had. And worse, there were no return tracks. We grabbed flashlights and followed the footprints. They led deep into the trees, past where we could see the cabins. The deeper we went, the more uneasy I felt. "Anna!" we shouted. Still nothing. The tracks continued for nearly half a mile before they just stopped. No sign of struggle. No sign of her turning around. Just an ending, as if she had vanished into thin air. We stood in a circle, our breath heavy, the forest silent around us. "This isn't possible," Sarah whispered. James shone his flashlight in all directions. "Maybe she's hiding." Maybe she sat down, and the snow covered the rest of the tracks. But the snow had stopped falling before she left. There was nothing fresh on the ground. No one wanted to say what we were all thinking. People don't just disappear. We searched for hours, shouting her name, scanning every tree and shadow. But we found nothing. No more footprints, no signs of movement, nothing that explained where she had gone. Eventually, the cold became unbearable. We had no choice but to return to the cabin. The mood was completely different now. No one spoke. No one laughed. The warmth of the fire didn't reach us. We sat in silence, listening to the wind howl outside, hoping, praying, that Anna would just walk through the door and tell us it had all been a joke. She didn't. None of us slept that night. At first light, we went back out to search. We combed the entire area, retracing our steps, hoping to find some clue we had missed. Then we saw them. New footprints. But they weren't leading back to the cabin. They were circling it. Dozens of them, overlapping, weaving in and out of the trees as if someone or something had been walking around the cabin all night. Watching. We ran. We packed our bags in minutes, piled into the car, and drove. None of us spoke. We reported Anna missing as soon as we got back to town. A search team went up into the mountains, but they found nothing. No more footprints, no body, no signs of what happened. It was as if she had never been there at all. A few weeks later, I got a call from one of the other friends who had been there. He had been doing some research on the area, trying to find any explanation. Apparently, Anna wasn't the first person to disappear near those cabins. She wouldn't be the last. I've always loved winter cabins, something about the isolation, the quiet, the way the snow covers the world like a thick, suffocating blanket. I thought I needed that peace. I thought getting away from the city would help me clear my head. I was wrong. It started as a simple trip. I rented a cabin deep in the woods, far from any major roads, miles away from the nearest town. The listing promised solitude, beautiful scenery, and a wood-burning stove to keep warm. I packed food, a few books, and enough firewood to last a week. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting. The drive had taken longer than expected. Winding mountain roads covered in ice, barely plowed, with no guardrails. The kind of road where you don't make a mistake. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected, just one main room with a bed, a kitchen area, and a fireplace. No electricity, no running water, just the essentials. That was fine. That was what I wanted. After unpacking, I lit a fire, made myself some coffee, and sat by the window, watching the snow fall. It was peaceful. Perfect. Until I saw him. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A shadow moving between the trees, barely visible against the white landscape. A man, standing at the edge of the tree line, too far to make out details. Just a dark figure, unmoving, watching. I blinked. He was gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a trick of the light. Maybe my own reflection in the window. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. My mind was adjusting. But as night fell, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, I stepped outside to gather firewood. The air was crisp, the snow fresh, untouched, except for one thing. Footprints, leading from the woods to my cabin, stopping just a few feet from my window. I felt my stomach tighten. My first thought was that maybe it was a hunter or a lost hiker. But something felt wrong. There were no return tracks. Whoever, or whatever, had walked up to my cabin hadn't walked away. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my breath fogging in the cold air. Then I turned and scanned the tree line. Nothing. Just the endless stretch of snow and trees. I told myself it was fine. Maybe the snow had covered the return tracks overnight. Maybe I had just missed them. I went inside, locked the door, and forced myself to forget about it. That night, I woke up to a sound. A slow, deliberate crunching of snow. Footsteps. I lay there, heart pounding, listening. The steps circled the cabin, slow and steady. Not rushed, not uncertain. Whoever was out there knew exactly what they were doing. I didn't move. I barely breathed. My mind raced. Should I grab a knife? Should I shout? Should I turn on a light? Then the sound stopped. Silence. I waited, listening, but there was nothing. I told myself it was the wind. Maybe an animal. Maybe just my imagination. But in the morning, I found new footprints in the snow. Fresh ones, circling my cabin. And this time, there was something else. Handprints. Pressed against my window. That day, I didn't leave the cabin. I kept the fire going, trying to shake the cold, the unease creeping into my bones. I tried to read, but my eyes kept flicking toward the window. Waiting. Watching. The day passed slowly, the silence heavy. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself that I was overreacting. Maybe I had panicked for no reason. Maybe the footprints were old. Maybe the handprints were just condensation, forming strange patterns in the frost. I locked the door. I double-checked it. Then I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, willing myself to relax. Then a sound. The doorknob. Turning. Not rattling, not shaking, just a slow, deliberate turn. I froze. My breath caught in my throat. The door was locked. It had to be. The turning stopped. Silence. Then footsteps. Moving away from the door, back into the snow. I didn't move until morning. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I didn't. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I had driven too far to just turn around over some footprints. The third night was worse. I didn't sleep. I sat up in bed, holding the heaviest knife I had, listening. Then, around midnight, footsteps. But this time, they didn't stop at the door. They walked around the cabin, slowly, methodically, circling, again, and again, and again, for hours. I sat there, gripping the knife, staring at the door, waiting for it to open. It never did. But I knew, without a doubt, that whoever was out there was enjoying this. Waiting. By the time the sun rose, I had made my decision. I was leaving. I packed my things in minutes, throwing everything into my bag without caring if I forgot something. I just needed to get to my car, get down the mountain, get away from this place. I stepped outside. The footprints were everywhere. Hundreds of them, crisscrossing, circling, moving in impossible patterns. And then I saw it. Another cabin. I had never noticed it before. Just a little further into the trees, barely visible through the snow. Something was wrong. I knew these woods. I had checked the area before renting the cabin. There was supposed to be nothing else out here. But the cabin was there. And the door was open. I should have walked away. I should have run. But I didn't. I stepped toward it. Inside, there was no furniture. No fireplace. No signs of anyone ever living there. Just one thing. A chair. Facing the window. And the window faced my cabin. Watching. Waiting. I ran. I didn't look back. I reached my car, started the engine, and drove. The road was treacherous, but I didn't care. I needed to get away. When I finally reached town, I stopped at the nearest gas station, my hands still shaking. I told the clerk about the other cabin. He gave me a strange look. "There's no other cabin up there," he said. I didn't argue. I just nodded, paid for my gas, and left. I never went back. But sometimes in the dead of night I hear it. Footsteps. Circling. I rented the cabin for one reason: isolation. Life had been too loud lately. Too many people, too many obligations, too much noise. I wanted silence, somewhere deep in the woods where the only sound would be the wind through the trees and the crackling of a fire. The cabin was perfect. A single-story wooden structure nestled in a valley, miles away from the nearest paved road. It had no electricity, no running water, just a fireplace, a gas lantern, and an old hand pump outside for water. It was exactly what I needed. I arrived just before sunset, my truck kicking up dust on the narrow dirt road. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, the smell of damp earth thick in the air. A storm was coming. That didn't bother me. In fact, it made the idea of staying here even better. A cabin, a fire, a storm outside. I couldn't have asked for a more peaceful setting. At least, that's what I thought. The first few hours were perfect. I brought in my supplies, lit the lantern, and started a fire in the stone fireplace. The warmth spread through the small room, pushing out the cold that had settled inside. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees, rattling the wooden shutters. The storm arrived in full force, rain hammering against the roof, thunder rumbling through the valley. I sat in the old rocking chair near the fire, sipping whiskey, letting the storm lull me into a calm state. Then came the knocking. It was soft at first. 3 slow knocks. I sat up, the glass in my hand freezing halfway to my lips. The wind screamed outside, the trees creaked, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Someone knocked. I waited, listening. Silence. I let out a breath, shaking my head. It had to be a branch blown against the cabin. Then it came again. 3 knocks. Louder this time. My heart pounded. No one should be out here. No one. The nearest house was miles away, the road barely passable in this storm. I stood up slowly, moving toward the door. "Hello," I called out. No answer. I hesitated, then grabbed the rifle I had brought with me. Just in case. I unlocked the door, opened it an inch. The wind pushed hard against it, rain slashing into my face. The lantern's glow barely reached beyond the porch, but I could see the ground was muddy, covered in leaves and debris. No footprints. No sign of anyone. I stepped out onto the porch, the storm swallowing me whole. My shirt clung to my skin, the cold rain biting. I peered into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees swaying violently in the wind, the shadows shifting as lightning flashed. I swallowed hard and stepped back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was nothing. Just the storm. My imagination. Then I saw the water. A single wet footprint on the wooden floor. Inside the cabin. I stood frozen, staring at the footprint. It wasn't mine. I had taken off my boots by the door, and my socks were dry. This footprint was fresh. Someone had been inside. I gripped the rifle, my pulse hammering in my ears. I turned, scanning the small room. The fireplace cast flickering shadows on the wooden walls. The bed was empty, the kitchen area undisturbed. But the door to the small storage room was slightly open. I had left it closed. I took a slow step forward, my breath shallow. The wood creaked beneath my weight. I reached out and pushed the door open. Nothing. The room was empty. Just a few shelves with canned food, some old tools. I exhaled, my muscles aching from tension. Maybe I was losing it. The storm, the isolation, it was messing with my head. I wiped away the footprint with a towel, trying to push down the unease clawing at my gut. I checked the door again, still locked. The windows too. I was alone. I had to be. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, the rifle within arm's reach, listening to the storm. Every gust of wind sounded like movement. Every creak of the cabin like a footstep. By morning, the storm had passed. A thick fog covered the valley, the trees barely visible through the mist. I decided to check around the cabin, just to be sure. The ground was soaked, the dirt road nearly washed out. I circled the cabin slowly, looking for footprints. Signs of someone else. Nothing. I shook my head. Maybe I really had imagined it. Maybe the footprint had been mine after all, and I was just spooking myself. I went back inside, made coffee, tried to shake the unease still sitting in my chest. Then I saw him. Through the window. A man. Standing at the edge of the trees. Motionless. Watching me. I froze, my grip tightening around the coffee mug. He was tall, dressed in dark, soaked clothes, his face pale against the shadows of the forest. He didn't move. I swallowed hard, every instinct screaming at me to grab the rifle. But I didn't. Instead, I stepped toward the window, trying to get a better look. Lightning flashed in the distance. And he was gone. I rushed outside, my heart slamming against my ribs. The fog clung to the trees, making it impossible to see far. I ran toward where the man had been standing. Nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. Just silence. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. A deep, sinking feeling settled in my gut. I wasn't alone out here. And whoever was out here with me didn't want to be found. That night, I barricaded the door. I moved the heavy wooden table against it, checked the rifle a dozen times. The lantern flickered, the fire crackling low in the hearth. I sat in the chair, watching the door. Waiting. Sometime after midnight, the knocking started again. 3 knocks. Slow. Deliberate. I gripped the rifle, my hands slick with sweat. The knocking came again. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the doorknob turned. Not violently, not with force. Slowly, as if whoever was on the other side knew I was watching. I raised the rifle, my finger on the trigger. Then, silence. The doorknob stopped moving. The knocking didn't come again. I sat there, shaking, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. I didn't sleep. At first light, I packed my things. I didn't care about the food, the supplies. I just wanted to leave. The road was worse than before, the mud deep, my truck struggling. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached town an hour later, my hands still gripping the wheel too tightly. I stopped at a diner, ordered coffee, tried to calm down. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, noticed my shaking hands. "You okay?" she asked. I hesitated. Then I told her. Not everything. Just the knocking. The man in the rain. The feeling of being watched. She listened, her face unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. "You're not the first," she said. A cold chill ran down my spine. "What do you mean?" I asked. She glanced out the window, toward the fog-covered valley. "A man went missing up there. Years ago. During a storm. They never found his body." I swallowed hard. She turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "People still see him sometimes." I stared at her. Then I got up, left cash on the table, and walked out. I never went back. And I never stopped dreaming about the knocks. I still remember the way the Cowden family's disappearance spread through our small Oregon town. One day, they were just gone. No trace. No answers. It was Labor Day weekend, September 1974. Richard Cowden, his wife Belinda, their 5-year-old son David, and their little daughter Melissa, who was just 5 months old, had gone camping in the Siskiyou Mountains near Carberry Creek. I wasn't much older than David at the time. I lived in the same town, White City, Oregon. It was the kind of place where people knew each other by name, where parents let their kids ride bikes until dark, and where something like a whole family disappearing just did not happen. The last time anyone saw them was on September 1st. That morning, Richard took David down to the Copper General store, just a few miles from their campsite. The store owner later told police that Richard seemed normal, buying a carton of milk before heading back toward camp. That was it. The last sighting. On September 2nd, Labor Day, the Cowdens were supposed to visit Belinda's mother for dinner. They never showed. At first, she wasn't too worried. Maybe they got delayed or decided to stay another night. But as the hours passed, dread settled in. By evening, she drove up to their campsite herself, and what she saw sent a chill through her. The Cowden family's truck was still parked there, untouched. The campsite was strangely perfect. Their belongings were all in place. A half-finished meal was sitting on the picnic table. The truck was locked. The keys and Richard's wallet were inside. A diaper bag was still there. Belinda's purse was untouched. But the worst part, the carton of milk Richard had bought that morning was still on the picnic table. Half full, warmed by the afternoon sun. There was no sign of struggle. No blood. No torn-up campsite. Just nothing. The Cowdens were gone. That night, panic spread fast. A massive search effort began immediately. Local police, volunteers, forest rangers, hundreds of people combed the area. Helicopters flew over the thick tree line, looking for signs of movement. Nothing. At one point, investigators brought in tracking dogs. The dogs circled the campsite, sniffing around for a while, then stopped. They sat down. They wouldn't go any further. That was a bad sign. It meant the scent ended abruptly, as if the Cowdens had been lifted off the ground and vanished into thin air. Some people whispered about wild animals. Others thought maybe they had fallen into the creek and drowned. But that didn't explain the campsite. It was too perfect, too untouched. Someone took them. We just didn't know. Days turned into weeks. Search efforts continued, but the forest was vast. It swallowed secrets whole. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some thought Richard had snapped. Maybe he killed his own family and ran. But that didn't make sense. People who knew him said he was a quiet, kind man, dedicated to his wife and kids. Others feared it was something worse. Something deliberate. One of the worst theories was that the Cowdens had been abducted by someone who knew the area. Someone who had been watching them. Someone patient. A few hunters swore they saw something. A man, standing deep in the woods, watching from a distance. But by the time they looked back, he was gone. 7 months later, On April 12, 1975, two men were hiking near Carberry Creek, about 7 miles from the Cowdens campsite. It was an area with steep hills, thick trees, and hidden caves. They didn't mean to find anything. They were just passing through. But then they saw it. A small pile of rocks. Unnatural. Placed there by someone's hands. One of the men knelt down and brushed the dirt away. His hands trembled as he uncovered a human skull. The police arrived within hours. As they searched the area, they found 4 sets of remains. Richard's body was found leaning against a tree, his spine riddled with bullet holes. Belinda and 5-year-old David were discovered in a shallow cave, partially covered with rocks. Melissa, the baby, was found with them. Investigators knew almost immediately this was no accident. The killer had executed Richard first. Then, he took Belinda and the children to the cave. And that's where he ended them. For years, no one knew who did it. The case sat cold, gathering dust. Then, in the late 1970s, a name surfaced, Dwayne Lee Little. Little was a convicted murderer. Back in 1964, when he was only 16, he had raped and killed a teenager named Orla Faye Phipps. He was sentenced to life in prison. But in 1974, just months before the Cowdens disappeared, he was let out on parole. The timing was chilling. Witnesses later recalled seeing a strange man in the area that weekend. A man driving a dark-colored pickup. A man who looked like Dwayne Lee Little. Even more disturbing, in 1975, Little was sent back to prison for violating parole. While behind bars, another inmate claimed he had confessed to killing the Cowden family. But without solid evidence, he was never officially charged. To this day, no one has ever been convicted of the murders. The Cowden family's case remains one of Oregon's most chilling, unsolved crimes. The campsite is still there. People still camp at Carberry Creek, but many say the air feels different. The forest seems too quiet. Some campers claim to hear whispers at night. Others say they wake up to the sound of children crying. I don't believe in ghosts, but I do believe in monsters. And some monsters, the real ones, never get caught. In January 1959, 10 young hikers set out on an expedition into the Ural Mountains of Soviet Russia. They were experienced, skilled in survival, and eager for adventure. Their goal was to reach the Otorten Mountain, a challenging yet achievable route. The leader, Igor Dyatlov, had carefully planned every detail. Their group included Igor Dyatlov, 23, the leader, strong-willed and respected. Zinaida Kolmogorova, 22, energetic, outgoing, and popular. Yuri Doroshenko, 21, brave, known for his temper. Ludmila Dubinina, 20, tough, determined, and serious. Rustam Slobodin, 23, a skilled athlete, level-headed. Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, 24, a jokester, light-hearted. Alexander Kolevatov, 24, intelligent and logical. Semyon Zolotaryov, 38, a military veteran, older than the others. Yuri Krivonischenko, 23, a prankster, always smiling. Yuri Yudin, 21, the 10th member, who turned back early due to illness. It was Yudin's fate that saved him. He never reached the deadly mountain with his friends. The 9 who continued had no idea they were walking into a nightmare that would never be explained. For days, the hikers followed their plan, keeping detailed journals and taking photos. Their spirits were high, despite the brutal cold. By February 1st, they had reached a slope near Kholat Syakhl, which meant Dead Mountain in the local Mansi language. The area was known for its harsh conditions, but they decided to set up camp on the exposed slope instead of the safer forest below. Some believe they did this because they wanted a challenge. Others think they had no choice. Their last photograph, taken before nightfall, shows them laughing, setting up their tent, completely unaware that they would never leave that place alive. When the hikers failed to send word back by February 12th, their families grew anxious. Days passed, and no news came. By February 20th, the Soviet government sent a search team. What they found made no sense. The campsite was discovered on February 26th, buried in snow. The tent was half collapsed, yet standing, but it had been cut open from the inside. Why would they slash their own tent open instead of using the entrance? Even stranger, there were no signs of struggle. But footprints, barefoot, some wearing only socks, some in just one shoe, led away from the tent. The searchers followed them into the woods. 1.5 kilometers from the tent, at the edge of the forest, they found the first bodies. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko lay near the remains of a small fire. Both were barefoot, dressed only in underwear. Their hands were burned, the skin on their fingers torn and raw, as if they had desperately tried to climb the nearby tree. The branches above them were broken. It was as if they had been trying to escape something. Nearby, they found more bodies. Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Slobodin were found between the fire and the tent, sprawled in the snow. All seemed to be heading back toward the tent when they died. They were better dressed than the first two, but still not enough for the freezing cold. Slobodin's skull was fractured, but not in a way that should have killed him. His cause of death was still hypothermia. The rescuers asked themselves the same question over and over. Why did they run from their tent half-dressed? What could have terrified them so much that they ran into a freezing night without shoes, coats, or protection? But the worst was yet to come. It took 2 more months to find the last 4 bodies. On May 4, 1959, they were discovered in a deep ravine under 4 meters of snow. They were the most disturbing of all. Dubinina, the Bobrignols, Kolevatov, and Zolotaryov had suffered horrific injuries. The Bobrignol's skull was crushed. Dubinina and Zolotaryov's ribs were shattered. Dubinina's tongue was missing. Yet, strangely, there were no external wounds on their bodies. It was as if something had crushed them from the inside. Doctors later said their injuries were like those from a car crash, massive force, but no bruises or cuts on the skin. No human could have done this. No animal. No avalanche. And radiation was found on their clothes. What had happened in that ravine? The Soviet government quickly closed the case. The official cause? Unknown natural force. But the public wanted answers. Over the years, many theories have tried to explain the Dyatlov Pass incident. Theory 1, avalanche. Some say an avalanche forced them to flee in terror, leaving them exposed to the cold. But if an avalanche had struck, why was the tent still standing? Why were the footprints still visible? Why were the injuries so different? Theory 2, military tests. Others believe secret Soviet weapons tests caused their deaths. Strange lights were reported in the sky that night. The radiation on their clothes suggested something unnatural. The government acted quickly to silence the case. Were they accidental victims of a secret test? Theory 3, infrasound. Some scientists suggest that strong winds created a low-frequency sound that caused panic, hallucinations, and terror. This might explain why they fled in fear, but it doesn't explain the deadly injuries. Theory 4, something else. Some believe something was in the forest that night. The broken tree branches suggested something chased them. Dubinina's missing tongue was never explained. The massive force of their injuries had no logical source. Had they seen something they weren't supposed to see? Or had something seen them? The Dyatlov Pass incident remains one of the greatest mysteries of all time. Decades later, no one knows for sure what happened that night. In 2019, a new Russian investigation blamed an avalanche again. But for those who have studied the case, the questions remain. Why did they flee? What crushed their bones? Why was radiation present? Why was the case rushed to be closed? The place where they died is now known as Dyatlov Pass, a frozen grave for a group of hikers whose fate may never be known. And to this day, the wind whispers through the mountains, carrying the last unanswered question. What really happened on that deadly night? I grew up with an obsession for the outdoors. My family owned a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods, near a quiet lake that was perfect for fishing and swimming in the summer. The land around it stretched for miles, and apart from a few hunters passing through during the season, it was rare to see another soul out there. Across a dirt road about 2 miles away from our cabin was a wildlife reserve, dense forests, rolling flatlands, and winding trails that led to who knew where. My parents always warned me not to wander too far, but as a kid, that warning only made me want to explore more. One summer when I was 16, I convinced my cousin Eric to come spend a few weeks at the cabin with me. He was the same age as me, lanky, always cracking jokes, and just as eager for adventure. We planned to hike, fish, and stay up late telling stories by the campfire. One afternoon, after a long morning of swimming in the lake, Eric and I decided to go exploring. The dense trees beyond the dirt road had always intrigued me. I'd wandered around their edges before, but never gone deep enough to see where the trails led. We packed some water bottles, a couple of snacks, and a pocket knife each, just in case. Then, with no real plan in mind, we set off into the trees. The forest was different from the ones near our cabin. The trees stood closer together, their branches tangled overhead, blocking out most of the sunlight. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. At first, I chalked it up to our footsteps scaring off the birds and squirrels, but after about 20 minutes, the silence felt unnatural. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just the sound of our own breathing and the occasional snap of twigs beneath our boots. Eric nudged me. "Feels weird, huh?" I nodded. "Yeah, maybe we should." That's when we saw the first house. It wasn't much, just the remains of a wooden structure, barely standing. The roof had collapsed, and the walls were warped and rotting. Thick vines crawled over what was left of the windows, and the door hung off its hinges. We exchanged a glance. "This place is old," Eric murmured. Curious, we stepped closer. The wood creaked under our weight as we peeked inside. The interior was nothing but broken furniture and dirt-covered floors. A rusted bed frame sat in one corner, the mattress long gone. An old fireplace crumbled in another. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. It was unsettling, sure, but it was also fascinating. Who had lived here? And why was it abandoned? We pressed on. A few minutes later, we spotted another house. Then another. Within minutes, we were standing in the middle of what looked like an old settlement. There were at least 8 or 9 buildings. Some small like the first, others bigger, possibly old stores or barns. Everything was in various stages of decay. Roofs caved in, walls barely holding up, windows shattered. Something about it felt wrong. It wasn't just that the place was abandoned. It was how it was abandoned. There were still rusted tools scattered outside one of the buildings. A wooden cart leaned against a rotting fence, its wheels long broken. It was like everyone had just up and left, leaving everything behind. "Dude," Eric said, voice low. "I don't like this." I didn't either. A strange pressure had settled in the air, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. I had the overwhelming sense that we weren't supposed to be there, that someone, or something, was watching us. Then I noticed something even stranger. Despite the obvious age of the buildings, there were no signs of overgrowth inside them. The trees around the settlement were thick, the underbrush wild. But inside the houses, no vines, no roots breaking through the floors, just dust and emptiness. Nature had reclaimed everything except the interiors. That was when I heard the footsteps. They came from the far end of the settlement, slow and deliberate. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Eric and I froze. My first thought was that it was an animal, maybe a deer. But something about the steps was wrong. Too heavy, too human. I gestured for Eric to move. We ducked behind the remnants of an old wooden fence, pressing ourselves against the rotting wood. The footsteps continued. They weren't fast. Whoever, or whatever, it was taking their time. Walking slowly, almost as if they were looking for something. Looking for us. Then silence. I held my breath. My pulse pounded in my ears. Eric's eyes were wide, his body completely still. Then a creak. The unmistakable sound of a door opening. Someone had just stepped into one of the houses. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I grabbed Eric's arm and ran. We sprinted back the way we came, ducking through the trees, our breaths ragged. I didn't dare look back. I didn't want to see what was behind us. The forest was still silent. No birds. No wind. Just our footsteps pounding against the earth. After what felt like forever, we burst out onto the dirt road near our cabin. Only then did I stop, bending over, gasping for air. Eric was pale. What the hell was that? I shook my head. I don't know. We didn't go back inside the cabin right away. Instead, we stood there listening, watching the tree line. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just stillness. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had disturbed something. That whatever was out there had seen us. And that it had let us leave. That night, we locked every door and window. We kept the lights off. We barely spoke. At around midnight, I woke up suddenly. It took me a second to realize why. There was a sound outside. Not footsteps. Not knocking. Just breathing. Slow, deep breathing. Right outside the window. Eric was awake too. He had heard it. His eyes met mine in the darkness. Neither of us moved. The breathing continued. Then it stopped. A minute passed. Then another. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I must have dozed off. By morning, the sound was gone. But in the dirt outside our window, there were footprints. Bare footprints, leading from the trees to our cabin, but not away. I never believed in horror stories. At least, not the kind you hear in books or movies. I always thought real horror came from the things people did to each other, the kind of horror that left scars long after the fear had faded. But that was before I spent a weekend alone at my family's hunting cabin. It happened 5 years ago, during a particularly cold autumn. The leaves had already started to fall, and the air carried the sharp scent of decay. My uncle owned a small cabin deep in the northern woods, surrounded by miles of dense forest. It was a simple structure: one room, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a creaky old bed. No electricity, no running water, just the kind of place you went when you wanted to be completely alone. I had been going there since I was a kid, usually with family, but this time I was alone. My uncle had given me the keys, told me to use it whenever I wanted, and I figured a weekend of solitude would do me good. A break from the city, from people, from everything. I packed light, just enough food for a couple of days, a flashlight, my hunting rifle, and a book. The drive took nearly 4 hours, most of it on unpaved roads winding through endless forest. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I stepped out of my truck, stretching, breathing in the crisp air. The cabin stood there just as I remembered, small, sturdy, and silent. The windows were covered in a thin layer of dust, but everything else looked untouched. Except for one thing. The door was unlocked. I hesitated. My uncle always locked the place up when he left. It wasn't the kind of cabin you just left open, not with the occasional bear wandering through the area. Maybe he had forgotten. Maybe someone else had used it recently and left it that way. I pushed the door open slowly. The inside was exactly as I remembered: wooden walls, an old stone fireplace, a worn-out rug covering part of the floor. A thick layer of dust covered most surfaces, except for the table near the window. That part was clean, like someone had been sitting there recently. A strange unease settled over me. Still, I brushed it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. Maybe it was just a draft that pushed the door open. Or maybe my uncle had left in a hurry and forgot to lock it. I stepped inside, shut the door, and bolted it. The first few hours were peaceful. I made a fire, cooked some canned food, and sat by the window, listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The wind whistled through the trees, and every now and then I heard the rustling of small animals in the underbrush. By the time I got into bed, the fire had died down to glowing embers. The only light came from the full moon outside, casting pale shadows through the window. I must have dozed off at some point. Then something woke me up. A noise. A faint, distant sound. I lay still, heart pounding, trying to listen over the crackling of the last embers. It was coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind. But then I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. I held my breath. Someone was walking around the cabin. My rifle was leaning against the wall near the bed. I reached for it as quietly as possible, gripping it tight, my hands sweating. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense. Then, a single knock on the door. Not loud, not urgent, just a knock. I didn't move. Another knock. And then silence. I stayed awake for hours, listening, gripping my rifle. But the knock never came again. By morning, I was convinced I had imagined it. Maybe it was an old tree creaking in the wind, or an animal bumping against the porch. I stepped outside cautiously, rifle in hand. The air was cold, the ground damp with morning dew. Then I saw them. Footprints. Bare footprints. They started from the edge of the trees and led directly to my door. No tracks leading away. Whoever had been there hadn't left. A chill ran down my spine. I scanned the tree line, rifle raised, searching for any sign of movement. But the woods were silent. Too silent. I told myself it had to be some kind of prank. Maybe a hunter messing with me. Maybe some lost hiker who had wandered too close. But the prints were bare. Who the hell walked barefoot in the middle of the woods at night? The rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't stray far, didn't let the fire die out. Every time the wind rustled the trees, I found myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there. But the forest remained empty. That night, I locked the door, bolted the windows, and kept my rifle close. Sleep didn't come easily. Every sound outside made my heart race. The wind howling through the trees, the creak of old wood, the occasional snap of a branch. Then, sometime around midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. Slow. Heavy. Closer than before. I sat up, gripping the rifle, my mouth dry. Then a knock. I stared at the door, my breath frozen in my chest. Then another knock. Louder this time. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to move. I crept toward the window, careful not to make a sound. Slowly, I lifted the curtain just an inch, just enough to peek outside. And that's when I saw him. A man, standing right outside the door. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in tattered clothes that hung loosely from his frame. His skin was pale, almost gray in the moonlight. But it was his face that made my blood turn to ice. He had no eyes, or rather, his eye sockets were empty. Just dark, hollow voids staring straight ahead. He raised a hand and knocked again. I stumbled back, my chest tight with panic. Then, the doorknob turned. I raised my rifle, aiming at the door, my hands shaking. The knob rattled violently, but the bolt held. For what felt like an eternity, the man just stood there. Then, without a word, he turned and walked into the woods. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I packed my things, threw open the door, and sprinted to my truck. I didn't look back. The drive back to the city was a blur. My hands shook the entire time. I didn't stop until I was miles away from those woods, from that cabin, from him. When I finally told my uncle what had happened, he went pale. He didn't ask me if I was sure. He didn't tell me I had imagined it. He just said one thing. I should have told you. Told me what? I asked. He hesitated. Then, you were never supposed to stay there alone. I never went back. I always liked being alone in the woods. Something about the quiet made me feel at ease, like the world had slowed down just enough for me to breathe. I had spent years hiking, hunting, and camping in the most isolated places I could find. That's why, when I got the chance to spend a full week in a cabin deep in the Oregon wilderness, I didn't hesitate. A friend of mine, Greg, had inherited the place from his uncle. It was old, simple, and completely off the grid. No power, no cell service, and no roads leading directly to it. You had to drive out on a rough logging road for miles, park at a clearing, and hike another 2 hours just to reach it. Greg had been out there a few times, but said he never stayed long, claimed he wasn't really the outdoors type. But he knew I was, so when he offered to let me use the cabin for a while, I jumped at the chance. I packed light. Just the basics, some food, a good knife, a rifle, extra clothes, and a sleeping bag. I figured I'd spend the week hiking, fishing, maybe even doing some hunting if I found a good spot. The idea of being completely cut off from everything sounded perfect. I left early in the morning, making the long drive out to the parking area just as the sun started rising. The trail to the cabin was rough, mostly an old game trail, narrow and uneven, winding through thick pine forest. It was colder than I expected, and the air had that damp, heavy feel that comes right before snow. I moved fast, wanting to get to the cabin with plenty of daylight left. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping behind the treetops. The cabin was smaller than I imagined. One room, a stone fireplace, and a tiny porch that overlooked a clearing. There was a creek nearby, its steady trickle the only sound besides the wind in the trees. It was perfect. I dropped my pack inside, gathered some wood, and got a fire going. As the flames warmed the cabin, I felt myself relax. It had been a while since I'd been somewhere this quiet. That night, I sat on the porch, staring into the dark woods, listening. No cars, no distant hum of power lines, just the wind and the occasional snap of a branch somewhere deep in the forest. Then I heard something. It was faint, but it was there, a soft crunch in the snow, somewhere off to my right. A single footstep. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. I told myself it was an animal. A deer, maybe. Or a coyote. The woods were full of life. Nothing to be concerned about. I went inside, locked the door, and settled into my sleeping bag by the fire. The next day was cold, but clear. I spent most of the morning exploring, following the creek deeper into the woods. The land was rugged, filled with steep hills and thick undergrowth. At one point, I found a set of old animal traps, rusted and half buried in the dirt, probably left behind by some long-gone trapper. By the time I made it back to the cabin, the sky was already darkening. I made a small meal, stoked the fire, and sat outside again, watching the snow fall. That's when I noticed something. The woods felt different. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The silence. The wind had stopped. The creek had stopped making noise. The forest, which had been alive with sound the night before, was completely still. I scanned the tree line, my breath visible in the cold air. Then, that same soft crunch. A single step in the snow. Closer this time. I stood up slowly, heart pounding. The sound had come from the same direction as before, off to the right of the cabin. I stared into the trees, but all I could see was darkness. I told myself it was nothing. A tree branch falling. Snow shifting. Something normal. Still, I didn't stay outside much longer. That night, I kept my rifle next to my sleeping bag. By the third day, I was starting to feel uneasy. The air was colder, the sky darker. It hadn't snowed much overnight, just a light dusting. But when I stepped outside that morning, I saw them. Footprints. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. They started from the tree line, weaved through the clearing, and stopped about 10 feet from the porch. Just stopped. There were no prints leading away. I felt my stomach drop. Someone had been watching the cabin. Watching me. I spent the next hour circling the area, looking for more tracks. I didn't find any. Just those same footprints leading from the woods and stopping right in front of the cabin. I didn't know what to do. The hike back to my truck was long, and I didn't like the idea of walking through the woods alone with someone else out there. I spent most of the day keeping the fire going, trying to stay calm. I told myself it was old tracks, maybe left behind by a hunter days ago. But I didn't believe that. They were too fresh. By nightfall, I was exhausted. My nerves were shot, but I forced myself to sleep. Then, in the middle of the night, thud, a heavy sound against the cabin wall. I sat up fast, heart hammering. Thud. It was coming from outside. Right outside. I gripped my rifle and forced myself to stay still, listening. The sound moved, slow, deliberate. Something was walking around the cabin. I held my breath, trying to control my panic. Then, a soft knock on the door. Not hard, not rushed, just a slow, careful tap. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then silence. Minutes passed, maybe an hour. I couldn't tell. Finally, when I was sure I was alone, I reached for the lantern and lit it. The moment the light filled the cabin, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The front door was unlocked. I had locked it. I knew I had locked it. But now, the latch was unhooked. Someone had been inside the cabin. I didn't sleep. I waited for the first light of dawn, packed my things, and left. I moved fast, ignoring the burning in my legs as I hiked through the snow. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. When I finally reached my truck, I felt a wave of relief so strong I almost collapsed. I threw my gear in the back, climbed in, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the old logging road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. There, standing at the edge of the trees, half hidden in the shadows, was a figure. Watching me. I never went back. I found the cabin online. It was an old place, tucked deep in the woods, with a sloping roof and a porch that wrapped around the front. The pictures made it look quiet, peaceful, exactly the kind of place I needed. Life in the city had been too much lately. Too loud, too crowded. I wanted silence. A week alone, no emails, no traffic, just me, the trees, and the wind. I booked it without thinking twice. The drive out was long. Once I turned off the main highway, the roads got narrow, winding through thick forests with no signs of civilization. My cell signal dropped out miles before I even got close. The rental listing mentioned that reception was spotty, so I expected that. The directions were clear, though. I followed the road until I reached a dirt path that cut off into the woods, barely visible unless you knew where to look. The moment my tires left the pavement, I felt like I had crossed into another world. The trees pressed in on both sides, the sun barely making it through the branches. The cabin was exactly like the pictures, maybe a little more rundown. The wood was dark and weathered, the windows small and smudged. There was a fire pit out front, a rusted metal chair tipped over beside it. I parked and stepped out. The air smelled damp, earthy. The only sounds were the wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the old wooden porch. I grabbed my bag from the car, climbed the steps, and found the key under a loose board, just like the owner had told me. The lock was stiff, but it turned with a little effort. When I pushed the door open, dust floated in the sunlight. Inside, the cabin was small but cozy. A couch sat against one wall, an old fireplace across from it. The kitchen was barely more than a stove, a sink, and a fridge that hummed loudly in the quiet. There was one bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a back door that led out to the forest. I set my bag down and walked through, checking the place out. Everything felt still, like the cabin had been sitting untouched for a long time. The air inside had that closed-up smell, thick and stale. I opened a few windows to let in some fresh air. After unloading my stuff, I sat on the couch listening. I had expected peace and quiet, but this was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was empty. The kind of silence that felt too deep, too unnatural. I shook it off, chalking it up to nerves. I wasn't used to being this isolated. That first night was uneventful. I cooked a simple meal, read for a while, then went to bed early. The bed creaked every time I moved. The wind outside picked up, rustling the trees, making them sound like whispers. At one point, I thought I heard something else, a soft thud, like footsteps on the porch. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Probably just a branch falling. I told myself I was being paranoid. I wasn't used to being this far out in the woods alone. Every little noise felt amplified. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun barely made it through the thick trees, casting long shadows across the ground. I stepped outside with my coffee and sat on the porch. The world felt untouched out here. No distant hum of traffic, no voices, just the steady rustling of leaves. That's when I noticed something. The chair by the fire pit. It had been tipped over when I arrived. Now, it was upright, facing the cabin. I stared at it, trying to remember if I had moved it. I hadn't. I was sure of that. But maybe the wind had knocked it over before, and now it had settled back upright? I wasn't sure. I forced myself to ignore it. I spent the day hiking through the woods behind the cabin, following an overgrown trail that led up a hill. The climb was tough, but at the top, I could see for miles, endless trees stretching out in every direction. No signs of people, no rooftops, no roads. Just wilderness. It was beautiful. By the time I got back, the sun was setting. My legs ached from the hike, and I was starving. I made dinner, sat outside for a while, and then headed in for the night. That's when things started feeling wrong. As I locked the front door, I hesitated. Something in the air had shifted. It was a feeling deep in my gut, like I was being watched. I shook it off, went through my nighttime routine, and got into bed. The moment I turned out the light, the sound started. Soft, faint, footsteps. Not an animal. Not the wind. Footsteps, moving around the cabin. I lay frozen, barely breathing. They were slow, deliberate. Someone was out there. I forced myself to sit up, my heart pounding. I reached for my phone. No signal, of course. I had no weapon, nothing to defend myself with. Just my car keys on the nightstand. I waited, listening. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then, a creak. The porch. I held my breath. Another creak. Someone was on the porch. I eased out of bed, moving as silently as possible. My feet touched the cold floor. I crept toward the window, barely parting the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness. The trees shifting in the wind. Then a shadow. A shape. Not moving. Just standing there at the edge of the trees. Watching. I stepped back, my skin crawling. I stayed awake the whole night, every sound sending my heart racing. The footsteps never came back. The shadow never moved. When the sun finally rose, I threw my stuff into my bag, grabbed my keys, and walked to my car as fast as I could. The moment I turned the key, relief flooded through me when the engine started. I backed out, tires kicking up dirt, and drove down the narrow path without looking back. When I hit the main road, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone, standing at the tree line. But there was nothing. I never told anyone what happened. It sounded ridiculous, like some campfire story. But I know what I saw. I never went back. The woods have always been my escape. Ever since I was a kid, I found comfort in the solitude of nature. It's quiet, the whisper of leaves in the wind, the scent of damp earth after rain. Growing up in a crowded city, I always longed for open spaces, somewhere untouched by the constant noise of human existence. As I got older, my love for the outdoors turned into a habit. Whenever I had the chance, I would rent a remote cabin deep in Pennsylvania's forests, far away from paved roads and city lights. Just me, my backpack, a notebook, and the wild. It was my retreat from the world, a place where I could breathe, unwind, and let the quiet settle into my bones. I had been going to the same area for years. The trails, the streams, the rusted old signs nailed to trees. I knew them well. There was one particular path I liked to hike, a winding trail that cut through thick pines and led to a small clearing where an abandoned hunting cabin stood. It was a small, single-room structure made of dark, weathered wood, with a sagging tin roof and a rusted chimney sticking out like an old man's bent finger. It had always been empty. Every time I passed by, I'd stop for a moment, peering through the broken windows at the dust-covered interior. The place had been abandoned for years. No furniture, no signs of recent visitors, just a forgotten relic of another time. I always found it eerie but fascinating, like the remnants of a ghost town swallowed by the trees. But one evening, everything changed. It was late October, and the air had taken on the crisp bite of impending winter. I had driven up to my usual rental cabin, a small, modest place about 5 miles from the nearest paved road. No electricity, no running water, just a wood-burning stove and a few old gas lamps. Perfect. After settling in, I decided to take a walk before sunset, following my usual path toward the abandoned hunting cabin. The woods were quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves as a squirrel darted through the undergrowth. The scent of damp earth and pine needles filled the air, familiar and comforting. As I neared the clearing, I expected to see the cabin in its usual forgotten state. But this time, something was different. There was smoke rising from the chimney. I stopped in my tracks. The cabin had always been empty. For years, it had been nothing but a rotting shell. But now, there was a thin wisp of smoke curling into the evening sky, proof of a fire burning inside. I hesitated. My first thought was that maybe some hikers had taken shelter there for the night. But that didn't make sense. The cabin had no door, just an empty doorway with splintered wood where a door must have once hung. No one would willingly sleep in a place that exposed. And then I saw him. A man stood just outside the cabin, tending to a small, makeshift grill. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. His boots were scuffed, and his thick beard was flecked with gray. Around him, empty beer cans were scattered in the dirt. He turned slightly as I stepped closer, but he didn't acknowledge me right away. I wasn't sure what to do. It wasn't illegal to be here. This was public land, and I had as much right to walk this trail as anyone. Still, something about the situation felt wrong. I cleared my throat. "Hey there." The man finally looked up. His eyes were dark, unreadable. He nodded once, slow and deliberate, before turning his attention back to the grill. "Didn't know anyone was staying here," I said, trying to keep my tone light. He flipped whatever he was cooking, something dark and charred, and muttered, "Keep it moving. No food here." His words made my skin prickle. I hadn't said anything about food. I hadn't even looked at his grill. Something in my gut told me not to push the conversation any further. I gave a tight nod and started walking again, moving past the clearing and back toward my own cabin. But the feeling stayed with me, a gnawing unease that I couldn't shake. I didn't sleep well that night. Every creak of the cabin settled uneasily in my mind, every gust of wind outside sounding too much like footsteps. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the man was just some drifter or hunter passing through. Maybe he'd be gone in the morning. But when I hiked the same trail the next day, the smoke was still rising from the chimney, and there were more beer cans. Something about that place felt wrong now, tainted in a way I couldn't explain. I stayed away for the rest of my trip, avoiding that section of the woods entirely. A year later, I returned to the same rental cabin, bringing my wife, my sister, and a close friend along for the experience. I told them about the strange encounter, but by then, it felt like a distant memory, something I had overthought in the moment. Still, when we decided to go for a hike, I led them in a different direction, steering clear of the abandoned hunting cabin. But the woods have a way of leading you where they want you to go. Somehow, we ended up near the clearing anyway. The cabin was empty again, its doorway gaping like an open wound. The fire was long gone, and the only sign that anyone had been there was a pile of rusted beer cans scattered in the dirt, crushed and sun-bleached. A strange silence settled over us. My wife shifted uneasily, glancing toward the trees as if expecting to see someone watching. My sister wrapped her arms around herself, rubbing at the sudden chill in the air. And then we saw it. Just beyond the tree line, almost hidden in the shadows, was a single, fresh beer can. Placed carefully, deliberately, like a message. We left immediately. I haven't been back since. I never thought I'd be involved in a missing person case. I'd read about them. Stories of people vanishing into the woods, some found weeks later in places they had no reason to be, others never seen again. I always figured they were unlucky, maybe careless. I told myself that could never happen to me. But the thing about the woods, about the deep, untouched wilderness, is that it doesn't care about what you think you know. It was late January when I got the call. A group of hikers had rented a few cabins deep in the forests of upstate New York, in an area known for its stunning winter landscapes and heavy snowfalls. I wasn't part of their group, but I had been staying in a nearby cabin, alone like I preferred. I had spent most of the past few days enjoying the solitude, my wood stove crackling as the snow piled up outside. The call came from the owner of the cabins, an older man named Bill who had lived in these woods his whole life. He knew me well enough to trust my judgment. "Something's wrong," he said. His voice was tense, clipped. "One of the girls staying in the cabins is missing. Wandered off in the middle of the night, didn't take a coat, nothing." That got my attention. In these conditions, even an experienced hiker wouldn't last long in the snow without proper gear. Hypothermia could set in within minutes. I threw on my coat and boots, grabbed my flashlight, and stepped outside. The cold hit me immediately, a sharp, biting wind that cut straight through my clothes. The sky was dark, snowflakes drifting lazily under the glow of my cabin's porch light. Bill's cabin was only a short walk away. When I arrived, I found a group of people huddled inside, their faces pale and drawn. There were 6 of them in total, 3 guys, 3 girls. They looked like they were in their early 20s, probably college students on a winter getaway. One of the guys, a tall, athletic-looking kid with a beanie pulled low over his ears, stepped forward. "I'm Jake," he said. "Our friend Mia, she's gone." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Tell me exactly what happened." Jake exchanged a look with the others before answering. "We were drinking last night, playing cards, just hanging out. Everything was fine. Mia wasn't acting weird or anything. But at some point, she just got up and walked outside." "She didn't say anything?" I asked. One of the girls, a redhead with tear-streaked cheeks, shook her head. "She just left. No coat, no shoes. It's like she wasn't even thinking." A cold knot formed in my stomach. That didn't make sense. Did anyone see where she went? Another guy, his hoodie pulled up over his head, spoke up. "She headed toward the trees. We didn't even realize she was gone for a while. We thought she just went to the bathroom or something." Bill exhaled sharply. By the time they started looking, her tracks were almost gone. I turned to the window, looking out at the thick snow-covered woods. It had been snowing steadily for hours. If Mia had gone missing in the middle of the night, any footprints she left behind would be long buried. The forest was huge. The temperature was dropping fast. If we didn't find her soon, we wouldn't be looking for a missing person. We'd be looking for a body. "We need to start searching," I said. Jake nodded. "We've already checked around the cabins, the trails nearby. Nothing. Then we go deeper." We split into 2 groups. Bill took 3 of the kids, while I took Jake and the red-haired girl, who introduced herself as Lauren. Armed with flashlights, we headed into the woods. The search. The trees stretched high above us, their branches heavy with snow. The only sounds were the crunch of our boots and the occasional whisper of wind through the pines. My breath came in visible puffs as I swept my flashlight across the undergrowth. The further we went, the less untouched the snow looked. There were disturbances here and there, places where something had moved. Not footprints, not exactly. Just patches where the snow had been disturbed in a way that made my skin crawl. I crouched down, brushing my gloved fingers over one of the marks. "Something's been through here." Lauren shivered, hugging herself. "An animal? Maybe." I didn't believe that, but I didn't say it. We pressed on. The deeper we went, the heavier the feeling in my gut became. It wasn't just the cold or the exhaustion. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name. A wrongness. The woods were too quiet. No distant calls of owls, no rustling in the underbrush. Just silence, thick and heavy. Then Jake stopped suddenly, his breath hitching. "Look." He pointed ahead, his flashlight beam catching something hanging from a tree branch. A scarf. Bright red, fluttering slightly in the wind. Lauren gasped. "That's Mia's." I walked toward it, my boots sinking into the snow. The scarf was tied in a neat knot, secured to the branch at eye level. Not dropped. Not caught on a branch. Placed. I untied it, turning it over in my hands. It wasn't frozen, which meant it hadn't been here long. Lauren clutched Jake's arm. "What the hell is going on?" I didn't answer. My pulse was hammering now, my grip tightening around the flashlight. Something was ahead. I could feel it. We moved forward, and the forest seemed to press in around us. My breath felt too loud in the stillness. My heart beat a drum in my ears. Then I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the snow. My first thought was that we had found Mia. Relief surged through me. But then my flashlight beam hit her face, and my stomach turned to ice. She was standing barefoot in the snow, her skin pale as death. Her lips were parted slightly, her breath misting in the cold air. Her eyes were the worst part. They were wide, blank, staring at nothing. She wasn't shivering, wasn't moving, just standing. Lauren let out a small, strangled noise. Mia. Mia didn't react. I took a step closer. Mia, can you hear me? Nothing. She was barely dressed, just a thin sweater and leggings. Her feet were red and raw from the cold, but she didn't seem to notice. I reached out slowly, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her skin was like ice. That was when she moved. Her head snapped toward me so fast that I jerked back. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a single terrible moment, there was something in them, something not right. Then she collapsed. Jake lunged forward, catching her before she hit the ground. I helped him lift her, hoisting her up between us. Her body was stiff, unyielding, but she was breathing. We turned and started back the way we came, moving as fast as we could through the deep snow. Mia never spoke. Not once. Not even when we got her back to the cabin. Not even when she warmed up. Not even when we asked her what had happened. She just sat there, staring at the fire, her red scarf still clutched tightly in her hands. I never found out what happened to her that night. Neither did she. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway. My partner, Andrew, and I had been together for years, and this trip was meant to be a break from the constant pressure of our jobs. We had adopted our 7-year-old daughter, the previous year, and she had quickly become the center of our world. Living in Boston was exhausting, and this was our chance to breathe, just the three of us away from everything. The drive to the New Hampshire woods had been long but scenic. The trees grew denser as we drove, the paved road eventually turning into gravel. Our rental cabin was deep in the woods, a place recommended by a colleague who swore it was the most peaceful place on earth. We arrived in the late afternoon. The cabin was modest but cozy, sitting in a clearing surrounded by towering pines. The wooden structure had a wide front porch, a stone chimney, and a small dock that extended into a lake just a few hundred feet away. There were no neighbors in sight, just the wind through the trees, the scent of damp earth, and the sound of one giggling as she ran toward the water. Andrew and I unloaded the car. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. A single-story layout, one bedroom for us, another for one, and an open living area with a fireplace. The kitchen had all the basics, and there was even a bookshelf filled with old paperbacks. Perfect, Andrew said, stretching his arms. I smiled, watching one pick up pebbles by the water. This is exactly what we needed. I had no idea how horribly wrong things would go. The first night was peaceful. We ate dinner, played board games, and tucked one into bed. Andrew and I sat by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. Eventually, we turned in for the night, lulled to sleep by the sound of crickets outside. The next morning, we woke up early and went outside to explore. I made coffee while Andrew took his time waking up. Then I heard voices. I stepped onto the porch and saw one standing near the edge of the trees, talking to someone. A man. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in an old flannel shirt. His dark hair was cropped short, and he had a neatly trimmed beard. He stood several feet from one, his hands resting on his knees, as if trying to appear friendly. Alarm shot through me. "One," I called, striding toward her. She turned, her expression neutral. "Daddy, this is Leonard," she said, pointing at the man. The stranger smiled, but there was something off about it, too wide, too forced. "Good morning. I didn't mean to startle you. My name is Leonard." I positioned myself between him and one. "What are you doing here?" "I'm very sorry for the intrusion," he said. "I need your help." I glanced toward the cabin. Andrew was stepping onto the porch, watching us. "Help with what?" I asked, my pulse quickening. Leonard's expression shifted, his brow furrowing. "I know this sounds strange, but I need you to make a difficult decision. A sacrifice." My stomach turned. "You need to leave." Leonard sighed. "I wish I could, but we don't have much time." The words sent a shiver down my spine. Andrew joined me, standing close. "What's going on?" Leonard looked at us with something like pity. "Before I explain, my friends will be arriving soon." "Friends?" Andrew repeated. Leonard nodded. "3 others. Sabrina, Redmond, and Adrian. They're on their way. I took Wen's hand. We're going inside. Please, Leonard said, his voice pleading. I know how this sounds. But what's about to happen? You won't believe it. And I'm so sorry for that. I didn't respond. I ushered Wen inside, locking the door behind us. We debated calling the police, but we had no cell service. Our only option was to drive away. But before we could pack up, we saw them coming. 3 figures emerging from the woods, carrying objects in their hands. I felt sick. They looked like ordinary people. An older woman, a stocky man with red hair, and a woman in her 40s with a determined expression. But they weren't carrying weapons, exactly. Makeshift tools. One held something that looked like a club fashioned from tree branches. Another had what looked like a crude axe. We barricaded the door. Then the knocking started. Please, Leonard's voice came. Let us in. We don't want to hurt you. Andrew grabbed a fireplace poker. What the hell do they want? I didn't know. For nearly an hour, they waited outside, knocking, speaking softly. Then, without warning, Redmond, the red-haired man, began slamming his shoulder against the door. The wood groaned. We need to do something, I said, my voice shaking. Like what? Andrew snapped. Wen whimpered. Then, with one final hit, the door burst open. They stormed in, grabbing us before we could fight back. They weren't violent, at least not yet, but they were strong. Leonard held Andrew back while Adrian restrained me. Wen screamed. Please, Leonard said, his voice strained. Just listen. I struggled against Adrian's grip, but she didn't budge. Redmond, breathing heavily, stepped forward. We don't want to do this. Then don't. Andrew yelled. Leonard exhaled, eyes full of sorrow. One of you has to die. Silence. I felt like the floor had vanished beneath me. What? I whispered. Leonard's hands trembled. One of you has to choose. A willing sacrifice. If you don't, the world will end. I wanted to laugh, to scream, to tell them they were insane. But they believed it. I saw it in their eyes. Redmond turned to Leonard, nodded. Then, before I could react, Redmond dropped to his knees. I'm sorry, Leonard whispered. And he raised his weapon. Then he brought it down. I screamed. Redmond crumpled, blood pooling beneath him. Wen sobbed, burying her face against me. Leonard's face was pale. That was the first, he said. But it's not enough. You have to choose. We refused. Over and over, we refused. But they stayed. One by one, they sacrificed themselves. Sabrina next. Then Adrian. Each time, Leonard's sorrow deepened. As the night dragged on, the sky outside changed. Dark clouds rolled in. The wind howled. Thunder rumbled in the distance. Leonard, the last one standing, looked at me with exhausted eyes. Please, he whispered. I don't want to be alone. Andrew and I held Wen between us, refusing to speak. Leonard exhaled. Then, gripping his weapon, he did what the others had done. The silence that followed was deafening. The storm outside roared. The cabin shook. And we sat there, holding one, waiting for the world to end. But morning came. The sun rose. The world kept turning. And we were left to wonder if it had ever been in danger at all, or if madness had simply come knocking at our door. We had been planning this trip for months. A cabin deep in the Tennessee woods, far from the city, no cell service, no distractions, just a week of drinking, hiking, and letting loose. There were 5 of us, me, my best friend Mark, his girlfriend Lisa, her cousin Jake, and Jake's girlfriend Emily. Mark had found the place online, some rundown rental that cost next to nothing. The owner didn't ask many questions, just told us where to find the key and warned us to be careful of wild animals. That should have been the first red flag. The drive took nearly 6 hours, most of it on winding roads through thick forest. The last half hour was pure dirt road, full of potholes and barely wide enough for Mark's SUV. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows over the clearing. The cabin itself was old, built from thick, weathered logs. The windows were covered in grime, and the front porch sagged in places. But it was bigger than we expected, with 2 floors and a small attic. Behind it, a narrow path led deeper into the woods. Mark shut off the engine, and we all piled out, stretching our legs and taking in the quiet. No birds, no insects, just silence. Creepy, Lisa muttered. Mark grinned. Perfect for a horror movie. Inside, the cabin smelled of dust and damp wood. The furniture was ancient, thick wooden chairs, a stone fireplace, bookshelves lined with old leather-bound books. The kitchen was stocked with rusted pots and mismatched silverware. Jake was the first to find the door to the basement. It was tucked away behind the staircase, a thick wooden door with a rusted latch. "Looks like a murder dungeon," he joked. He pulled the latch, and the door creaked open. A wooden staircase led down into pure darkness. The air that wafted up was thick with dust and something else, something rotten. "We have to check it out," Mark said, grabbing a flashlight. I hesitated but followed. The steps groaned under our weight, and the further we went, the colder it got. At the bottom, the flashlight beam swept across the basement. It was larger than expected, the walls lined with old shelves. Rusted tools hung from nails. Then we saw the table. A thick, wooden table sat in the center of the room, its surface covered in deep scratches. Chains hung from the ceiling above it, rusted but sturdy. Beside the table, an old tape recorder rested on a wooden stool. And next to that, a book. Jake picked it up. "Dude, this looks weird." It wasn't just old. The cover was thick leather, stitched together with what looked like crude string. The pages were yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten symbols and strange drawings. Some kind of language none of us could read. Lisa shuddered. "Let's put it back." Mark, of course, ignored her. He pressed a button on the tape recorder, and a crackling voice filled the basement. "The ritual is nearly complete. The darkness stirs. They are coming. They are." A sharp, high-pitched shriek cut through the static. Then silence. Emily turned to go. "Nope. We're done here. We should have left the book. We should have left the cabin. But we didn't. That night we drank. We laughed. The weirdness of the basement was forgotten as the alcohol kicked in. At some point, Lisa mentioned hearing something outside. A whisper. We brushed it off. It was a windy night, branches scratching against the windows. By midnight, everyone was asleep. I woke up to a noise, a low creaking sound. My heart pounded as I sat up, straining to hear. The front door was open. I stumbled out of bed and into the main room. The door swung slowly in the breeze. Outside, the trees stood like towering shadows. Mark stirred on the couch. "Dude, what's up?" The door. A branch snapped outside. Something moved just beyond the tree line. Not an animal. Not a person. A shape, tall, wrong, shifting in the dark. And then it was gone. Mark cursed, locking the door. "Just the wind," he muttered. But his hands were shaking. Neither of us slept after that. The next morning, Lisa was gone. We found her outside, standing at the edge of the woods. Her back was to us, her head tilted as if listening. "Lisa." She didn't move. Mark rushed forward, grabbing her shoulder. She turned, her eyes wide, unfocused. "They're whispering," she said softly. "They're so loud." She wouldn't say anything else. By noon, she seemed better. She laughed, said she didn't remember going outside. We forced ourselves to believe her. Then Emily found the footprints. They led from the trees to the cabin. Not just Lisa's. Something else. Bare, misshapen prints. Deep. Clawed. That night, it got worse. Lisa woke us with screaming. We found her in the kitchen, clawing at her own skin, blood dripping from her arms. Her eyes were wild. "They're inside," she sobbed. "They're inside my head." She convulsed, body jerking unnaturally. And then she laughed. Not her laugh. A deep, guttural sound. Mark grabbed her, shaking her. "Lisa, stop." She turned to him, smiling. Her teeth were wrong. Too sharp. Too many. Then she attacked. It took all of us to hold her down. She was stronger than she should have been, her nails ripping into our skin. Jake grabbed the book, flipping through it desperately. "There has to be something in here." And then she stopped. Went limp. Her head snapped toward Jake. Her mouth opened, but it wasn't her voice that came out. "You shouldn't have come." We ran. We made it to the car, shoving Emily into the back. The engine wouldn't start. Something moved in the trees. Shapes, shifting in the shadows. Eyes gleamed in the dark. Lisa stood on the porch, smiling. "You can't leave," she whispered. The whispers rose, swirling around us. Inside our heads. Inside our bones. Then Emily screamed. A hand, long, gnarled fingers, was reaching through the window, grabbing her hair. Mark punched the gas. The engine roared, the car lurched forward, knocking Lisa aside. We didn't look back. We didn't stop driving until the sun came up. At a gas station miles away, we finally pulled over. Lisa wasn't with us. We never found her body. Weeks later, the police went to the cabin. They found nothing. No book. No tape recorder. No Lisa. But the cabin? It was still there, waiting. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I still hear her voice, whispering. I never believed in ghost stories. At least, not until the night we spent in Blackwood Forest. It started as a simple adventure, 5 friends looking for a thrill. I was always the cautious one, the voice of reason, but something about this trip pulled me in. Maybe it was the challenge, the promise of uncovering the truth behind the legend, or maybe I just didn't want to be the one who chickened out. The legend was well known in our small town. Deep in Blackwood Forest, hidden away from the well-trodden hiking trails, was an abandoned cabin. No one knew who built it, or why it had been left to rot. The rumors ranged from a reclusive hermit who went insane to a family who had vanished without a trace. Some said people who went looking for it never came back. It was a story that had been passed down for generations, whispered around campfires and in hushed tones at sleepovers. We all thought it was just that, a story, until we found the cabin. It was a cool autumn afternoon when we set out. The group consisted of me, my best friend Kyle, his girlfriend Amanda, her cousin Jake, and our mutual friend Sarah. We packed light, flashlights, a few snacks, and a couple of pocket knives, just in case. None of us were particularly experienced hikers, but we had a rough idea of where we were going based on old maps and vague directions from online forums. The forest was beautiful, the kind of place that made you forget how close you were to civilization. Tall, ancient trees stretched toward the sky, their branches intertwining to form a dense canopy. The air was crisp, filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. At first, the hike was easy. We followed a well-worn trail, chatting and laughing, but as the hours passed and the sun began to dip lower in the sky, the atmosphere shifted. The trees grew thicker, the air colder. The sounds of birds and insects faded, replaced by an eerie silence. "We should have reached it by now," Amanda said, glancing at her phone. No signal. Kyle unfolded the map we had printed. "We're close," he assured us, but his voice lacked confidence. Sarah shivered. "This place feels wrong." None of us disagreed, but we weren't about to turn back. Not yet. We found it just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the treetops. The cabin was smaller than I had imagined, just a single-story wooden structure with a sagging roof and broken windows. The wood was dark with age, the door hanging slightly ajar as if inviting us in. Ivy crawled up the sides, nearly swallowing the building whole. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. "We made it," Jake said, breaking the silence. Kyle grinned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Let's check it out." We stepped onto the creaking porch, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. I hesitated at the threshold. Something about this place felt unnatural. "I don't think we should go in," I said. Kyle laughed. "Come on, man. What's the worst that could happen?" We stepped inside. The air inside was thick, musty. Dust coated every surface. The room was small, just a single open space with a rotting wooden table, a rusted stove, and a few broken chairs. There was a fireplace on one wall, its bricks blackened with age, and a narrow doorway leading to what must have been a bedroom. "This is creepy as hell," Amanda muttered. Sarah ran her fingers over the table, leaving trails in the dust. "It's like no one's been here for decades." Jake wandered toward the bedroom. "I'm going to check in here." The moment he stepped through the doorway, the cabin groaned. It was a deep, unsettling sound, like the wood itself was protesting our presence. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Kyle shrugged. "Old place. Probably just settling." Jake's flashlight flickered, then went out. "What the?" His voice cut off abruptly. Then we heard it. A low, raspy breathing. Jake stumbled back into the main room, his face pale. There's something in there," he stammered. "Don't mess with us, man," Kyle said, but his voice wavered. "I'm not messing with you," Jake snapped. "Something's in there." I shone my flashlight toward the doorway. The bedroom was empty. Dusty floorboards, a collapsed bed frame, nothing else. And yet, the breathing continued. Slow, deliberate. As if something was standing just beyond the reach of our lights. Amanda whimpered. "Let's go." The moment she spoke, the front door slammed shut. Sarah screamed. Kyle rushed to the door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. It stuck. Jake pounded against it. "Help me break it down." I turned back toward the bedroom. My flashlight flickered, then cut out completely. For a split second, in the pitch darkness, I felt something move. Something was in there with us. Panic set in. We slammed against the door, desperate to escape. The cabin groaned again, the sound deep and guttural, like the forest itself was breathing around us. Then the whispering started. Soft, unintelligible, like voices carried on the wind. It came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Sarah collapsed to her knees, sobbing. "Make it stop, make it stop." I grabbed Kyle's flashlight and aimed it toward the bedroom. The doorway was empty, but the breathing was louder now. Closer. Then the door burst open. We didn't hesitate. We ran. We didn't stop running until we reached the main trail. The forest was still eerily silent, but the cabin was far behind us. Only then did we realize Sarah was missing. We searched for hours, calling her name, but there was no trace of her. When we finally made it back to town, we went straight to the police. They combed the forest for days. No sign of her. It was like she had vanished into thin air. The authorities ruled it an accident, said she must have gotten lost. But we knew better. Something took her, and we never should have gone looking for it. The idea of spending a weekend alone in a remote cabin had seemed appealing at first. I had been feeling overwhelmed by work and personal matters, and the thought of escaping into the silence of the wilderness for a few days felt like the perfect way to clear my head. I had rented a small, rustic cabin deep in the forests of northern Montana, miles away from the nearest town. The place was old but well-maintained, with a simple wooden porch, a stone chimney, and a single dirt road leading up to it. It sat on the edge of a dense pine forest, with a small clearing in the back that sloped down to a quiet, glassy lake. The drive had been long and exhausting. By the time I arrived, the sun was already setting, casting long shadows across the towering trees. I turned off the engine of my truck and sat for a moment, taking in the deep quiet of the woods. There were no city noises here, no cars honking, no distant chatter of pedestrians, just the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional chirp of birds settling in for the night. I grabbed my backpack and stepped out of the truck. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine needles. Unlocking the cabin door, I stepped inside and took a quick look around. It was small but cozy, wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a small kitchen with an old gas stove, and a single bedroom with a large window facing the forest. I unpacked my bag, setting my essentials on the small dining table. Flashlight, matches, a hunting knife, and a paperback novel I had been meaning to read. I had no cell service this deep in the woods, but that was part of the appeal. No distractions, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. As I was setting up, I suddenly became aware of the eerie silence that had settled over the forest outside. The usual sounds of rustling leaves and chirping insects had faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. I glanced out the window, seeing nothing but the darkening woods stretching endlessly beyond the clearing. Shrugging off the uneasy feeling, I went about preparing a quick dinner. By the time I finished eating, the sky had turned completely black. With nothing else to do, I decided to step outside for some fresh air before heading to bed. That was when I saw it. I stepped onto the porch, wrapping my arms around myself as a cold breeze drifted through the trees. The only light came from the half-moon above, casting pale silver beams through the branches. The forest stood dark and silent, a wall of shadows stretching out before me. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as my eyes adjusted to the dim light, a shape caught my attention. A figure standing motionless among the trees, just beyond the clearing. My breath hitched. It was too dark to make out any details, but the silhouette was unmistakable. It was a person, tall and unmoving, positioned between two large pine trees, just standing there. A deep sense of unease settled over me. "Hello," I called out. My voice sounded too loud in the silence. No response. I took a step forward, trying to get a better look. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. A shiver ran down my spine. There were no other cabins nearby, no hiking trails that ran through this area. Whoever this was, they had no reason to be out here, standing in the dark woods, staring at me. I felt an instinctive urge to retreat, but I forced myself to stay calm. Maybe it was just a lost hiker. Maybe someone had wandered too far off a trail and ended up near my cabin. I cleared my throat. "Are you lost?" Again, no response. The figure remained completely still, as if it were carved out of the darkness itself. I couldn't see a face, couldn't make out any details, just that unnerving, shadowy shape watching from the trees. Something about its stillness unsettled me. It wasn't natural. Then, as if responding to my thoughts, The figure slowly stepped backward into the trees, vanishing into the darkness without a sound. My stomach clenched. I strained my eyes, trying to see where it had gone, but the woods were too dense, too shadowed. It was gone. Heart pounding, I hurried back inside the cabin, bolting the door behind me. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. A trick of the light. My eyes playing tricks on me. Maybe it had just been a tree stump or a weird shadow. But deep down, I knew better. I double-checked the locks on the windows and doors, making sure everything was secure. The cabin suddenly felt much smaller, the walls pressing in around me. Every creak of the wooden floor, every rustling noise outside made my pulse quicken. I decided to sleep with my hunting knife close by, just in case. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the dying embers in the fireplace. Then, just as I was finally starting to drift off, I heard it. A soft crunch. A footstep. My body stiffened. The sound had come from outside, near the porch. I held my breath, straining to listen. Another step. And another. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving closer. A chill ran down my spine. Someone was out there. I sat up, gripping my knife tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. Silence. I forced myself to move. Slowly, carefully, I slid out of bed and crept to the window, pressing my back against the wall. My heart was hammering so hard I thought whoever was outside might hear it. After a long moment, I took a deep breath and peered out the window. There was nothing there. Just the empty porch and the dark forest beyond. I swallowed hard. And then I saw them. Muddy footprints on the porch, leading directly to my door. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping my knife and listening to every sound. But whoever, or whatever, had been outside never tried to get in. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, I had already made up my mind. I was leaving. I packed up my things quickly, throwing them into my backpack with shaking hands. My gut told me that staying another night in that cabin was a bad idea. As I stepped onto the porch, the footprints from the night before were still there. Muddied impressions leading up to the door, but none leading away. A shiver crawled down my spine. I hurried to my truck, tossing my bag into the passenger seat. As I climbed in and started the engine, I glanced back at the cabin one last time. That was when I saw it again. Standing at the edge of the woods, just beyond the clearing, was the same figure. Watching, waiting. But this time, as I stared, it slowly raised one hand and waved. A cold dread settled over me. I slammed the truck into gear and tore down the dirt road, not looking back. I never found out who or what that figure was, and I never returned to that cabin again. It was a crisp autumn evening when I arrived at the cabin by the lake. The drive had been long, winding through dense woods that gradually swallowed the last remnants of civilization behind me. I had rented the place for a weekend, hoping to escape the relentless noise of the city and find some peace in nature. The cabin itself was small but well-maintained, a single-story wooden structure with a covered porch that faced the calm, reflective waters of the lake. The trees surrounding it stood tall and ancient, their leaves turning vibrant shades of red and orange. The scent of damp earth and pine filled the air, and the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the distant call of birds. I parked my car on the gravel driveway and carried my bags inside. The interior was cozy, warm wooden walls, a stone fireplace, a modest kitchen, and a bedroom with a single window that overlooked the lake. I had no plans for the weekend beyond reading, hiking, and enjoying the quiet. After settling in, I made myself a cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow across the water. It was beautiful, almost unreal in its tranquility. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease. As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the tree-line, I noticed something peculiar. A faint sound drifted through the air, so soft that I wasn't sure if I was imagining it at first. A melody, slow and melancholic, played somewhere in the distance. I frowned, listening more intently. The sound was faint but distinct, like an old gramophone playing a song from a forgotten era. It was coming from the woods beyond the lake. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe there was another cabin on the far side of the trees, and someone was playing music. But the idea didn't sit right with me. The melody had an eerie, almost ghostly quality to it, as though it were coming from somewhere much farther away than it should have. The music continued for a few more minutes before fading into silence. I waited, straining my ears, but it didn't return. With a shake of my head, I dismissed it as my imagination and went inside for the night. The next day was uneventful. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. I found no signs of other cabins or people. It seemed like I had the entire area to myself. By evening, I had almost forgotten about the strange melody. I built a small fire outside and roasted some marshmallows, watching as the flames flickered against the darkening sky. Then, just as the night fully settled in, I heard it again. The same haunting tune, drifting from the woods. This time, I was sure I wasn't imagining it. The melody was clearer than before, as if it had moved closer. My skin prickled. I turned off my flashlight and listened. The song was old, the kind of music you'd hear in black and white films. Something played on a gramophone in a grand, empty ballroom. It was beautiful, but there was something profoundly unsettling about it. A deep, gut-level instinct told me that I shouldn't be hearing it. That no one should. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight to scan the trees. The forest beyond my cabin was dense, filled with shadows that twisted and shifted in the dim light. The music played on, but I couldn't see any source. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. It felt as though the entire forest was holding its breath. A chill ran down my spine. I turned and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. That night, I barely slept. Morning brought a sense of calm, but it was fragile. I tried to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Maybe a hunter or camper had brought an old radio into the woods. Maybe sound traveled in strange ways out here. But a part of me knew better. After breakfast, I decided to investigate. I followed the direction from which the music had come, weaving through trees and stepping over fallen logs. The forest was dense, the air still. Every so often, I paused, half expecting to hear the melody again. After about an hour of walking, I found something that made my stomach drop. Sitting in a small clearing, covered in moss and leaves, was an old gramophone. I stared at it, my breath catching in my throat. It was ancient, its brass horn tarnished and rusted. The wooden base was weathered, the crank handle barely intact. It looked like it had been sitting there for decades. But that wasn't the worst part. The record on the turntable was still spinning. I took a step back, my pulse hammering in my ears. There was no electricity, no person in sight. And yet, the gramophone was playing a song I could no longer hear. I turned and ran. I spent the rest of the day trying to distract myself, but fear lingered in the back of my mind. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I convinced myself to stay. It was just an old, broken gramophone. It couldn't hurt me. That night, I locked the doors and windows, determined to ignore whatever happened. But just as I started to drift off, the music returned. This time, it wasn't coming from the woods. It was right outside my cabin. The haunting melody seeped through the walls, slow and deliberate. My blood ran cold. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering through the blinds. My breath caught. There, at the edge of my porch, stood the gramophone. It hadn't been there when I locked up. I was certain of that. The turntable was spinning, but no needle touched the record. The music played anyway. I stumbled back, heart pounding. This wasn't possible. Someone had to be playing a trick on me. But deep down, I knew that no one was there. The song played on, stretching the night into eternity. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I passed out. I woke to silence. For a long moment, I stayed still, afraid to move. When I finally gathered the courage, I crept to the window. The gramophone was gone. I rushed outside. The porch was empty, the woods still. There was no sign that anything had been there at all. I didn't question it. I packed my things and left, driving away without looking back. Weeks passed, and I tried to push the experience out of my mind. But some nights, just as I was about to fall asleep, I would hear it, faint and distant, as though carried by the wind. A haunting melody, calling me back to the woods. There's something unsettling about being deep in the woods, where civilization feels like a distant memory. You tell yourself you're safe, that the trees and the wind are all that surround you, but sometimes you get the sense that something else is out there, watching. I've been hunting since I was a kid. Grew up in Montana, where the land stretches wide and empty, where you can walk for miles without seeing another soul. My cousin Mike and I always made it a tradition to take a week-long hunting trip every winter. renting an old cabin up in the mountains. It was remote, basic, just 2 cots, a wood stove, and no electricity. Exactly the way we liked it. We'd been to this particular spot 3 times before, and nothing weird had ever happened. It was just another hunting trip. Until it wasn't. The first few days went by without a hitch. We tracked a few deer, set up some bait, spent the evenings cooking over the fire. At night, the wind howled through the trees, but that was normal in the mountains. On the 3rd night, I woke up suddenly. It took me a second to realize what had disturbed me. The wind had stopped. The air was still, too still. It was the kind of silence that makes you uneasy, like the whole forest is holding its breath. Then I heard it. A snap. A branch breaking somewhere outside. I turned my head toward the window, squinting into the darkness. The moon was bright enough to cast long shadows through the trees, but I couldn't see anything moving. Probably a deer, I told myself. Or maybe an elk. But something fell off. Another snap. Closer this time. Deliberate. I reached over and nudged Mike. He groaned, half asleep. "Someone's outside," I whispered. That got his attention. He sat up, listening. For a few minutes, there was nothing. Just that eerie silence pressing against the cabin. Then we heard it. A soft tap-tap against the side of the cabin. Mike grabbed his rifle, and I reached for my flashlight. We weren't the kind of guys to get spooked easily, but we'd also heard enough stories to know that being cautious wasn't a bad idea. I clicked the flashlight on and shined it through the window. At first, I didn't see anything. Just trees. Snow. The clearing in front of the cabin was empty. Then I saw it. Deep in the tree line, just at the edge of the light's reach, a figure. It was standing perfectly still. Not moving, not reacting to the light. Just watching. A man. Maybe. But something about the way it stood there, half hidden in the shadows, made my stomach twist. "Who the hell is that?" Mike whispered. I shook my head. "I don't know." I opened the window just a crack. "Hey, who's out there?" Silence. The figure didn't move. Didn't answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, it stepped back, just a single slow step, disappearing into the trees. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. We locked the door, checked our rifles, and took turns keeping watch. Every so often, I'd glance toward the tree line, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the forest. By dawn, we told ourselves it was probably some drifter, maybe a lost hiker. Someone who saw our cabin and decided to keep their distance. But that didn't explain the way he stood there. Watching. Silent. We decided to check the area after sunrise, just to be sure. There were footprints in the snow. Large ones. Leading from the tree line to our cabin, stopping just outside the wall where we'd heard the tapping. No prints leading away. We had 2 more nights in the cabin, and I won't lie, I wanted to leave early. But Mike convinced me to stay. Said it was probably nothing. Said we had our rifles, and that we weren't going to let some weirdo ruin our trip. I wasn't so sure. That night, we triple-checked the locks. We made sure the fire was going strong, and we kept our guns within reach. At around midnight, I woke up again. Not from a noise. Not from a dream. Just woke up, like something had pulled me from sleep. The room was pitch dark except for the faint glow of the dying fire. I listened, and then I heard it. A slow, deep breathing. Not mine. Not Mike's. Outside the window. I turned my head slowly. And there, pressed against the glass, a face. I barely bit back a yell. My heart slammed against my ribs as I scrambled for my rifle. But by the time I turned back, it was gone. Mike woke up to me swearing under my breath. What? What happened? I told him. We both sat there, staring at the window, the cold creeping into our bones. We didn't sleep at all after that. At first light, we packed up. We weren't staying another night. As we loaded up our gear, I took one last look around the cabin, and that's when I saw them. More footprints. Circling the cabin. Multiple sets. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there wasn't alone. We hiked back to our truck in silence. The whole way down, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing there. Watching. When we got back to town, we stopped at the general store to grab some coffee before heading home. The old guy behind the counter saw the look on our faces and asked if we were all right. We told him what had happened. Told him about the footprints, the tapping, the face in the window. He just shook his head. Y'all aren't the first to see him. I felt a chill run down my spine. What do you mean? I asked. He hesitated, then sighed. Couple years back, some folks rented that same cabin. Said they saw a man in the woods. Tall, silent, just watching. Mike and I exchanged a look. "Who is he?" Mike asked. The old man just shrugged. "No one knows." I pressed him further, but he wouldn't say anything else. We left that day and never went back. Sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I think about that face in the window, the silent figure standing in the trees, and I wonder if, somewhere deep in those woods, he's still watching, waiting. I've always preferred renting small, secluded cabins over staying in hotels when going on vacation. There's something peaceful about being away from everything. No city noise, no people crowding the streets, no distractions. Just nature, quiet, and fresh air. That's why my girlfriend Anna and I booked a remote cabin in upstate New York for a weekend getaway. It was an older place, built sometime in the 1950s, but from the pictures, it looked well-maintained, rustic, with a stone fireplace, a wraparound porch, and beautiful forest views. The listing mentioned it was a family-owned property, passed down for generations, and that it had plenty of charm. It sounded perfect. The drive took us nearly 5 hours from the city. As we got closer, the roads turned from asphalt to gravel, winding deeper into the woods. Cell service dropped completely about 30 minutes before we arrived. When we finally pulled into the driveway, I saw the cabin in person for the first time. It was exactly as the photos had shown, quaint but sturdy, nestled among towering pines. The front porch had a wooden swing, and there was a pile of neatly stacked firewood beside the door. The place looked inviting, despite its age. Anna smiled as she stepped out of the car and stretched. "I love it already," she said. I agreed. It felt like the kind of place where nothing bad could happen. I wish I had been right. Inside, the cabin was cozy but simple. The floors creaked under our steps, and the air smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The living area had a stone fireplace and a couch with faded cushions. A small kitchen sat to the right, stocked with the basics. There were 2 bedrooms down the hall, both with heavy wooden doors and thick curtains that blocked out the late afternoon sun. Anna wandered around, checking things out while I brought in our bags. "Hey," she called from the kitchen. "There's a welcome note." I walked over and read it with her. It was handwritten on a small piece of paper. "Welcome. Hope you enjoy your stay. If you need anything, call the number in the guest book. P.S. Sometimes the floorboards shift when it gets cold. Don't be alarmed." I didn't think much of it at the time. Old cabins creaked. It was just part of their character. We spent the rest of the evening settling in, cooking dinner, and sitting out on the porch, listening to the sounds of the forest. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the stillness of the woods around us. It was nice. We went to bed around 11. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up. At first, I wasn't sure what had disturbed me. The room was completely dark, and for a few moments, I just lay there listening. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, not from outside, where the wind occasionally stirred the trees, but from inside the cabin. It wasn't the normal settling noises of an old house. It was too deliberate. Anna was still asleep beside me, her breathing slow and steady. I held my breath, straining to pinpoint the noise. It came again, a soft shifting of weight on wood, like someone adjusting their stance. I sat up slowly, heart pounding. The sound wasn't coming from the bedroom. It was coming from somewhere beneath us. The crawl space. I listened for what felt like an eternity, but the sound didn't repeat. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the floor settling, like the note had said. I lay back down, but sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, I stepped into the kitchen to make coffee. That's when I noticed something strange. The small trapdoor in the floor, barely visible under the kitchen table, was slightly ajar. It was a tiny thing, maybe 2 feet by 2 feet, likely leading to a crawlspace for plumbing or storage. I hadn't noticed it the night before, but now, as I stared at it, I felt a cold prickle at the back of my neck. It hadn't been open yesterday. I crouched down, staring at the gap. It was subtle, just an inch or so, but enough that I could see the darkness beneath. I nudged it shut with my foot. Anna walked in, rubbing her eyes. "Morning," she murmured, heading for the coffee pot. I hesitated. "Did you open that?" I gestured at the trapdoor. She glanced down, frowning. "What?" "No. I didn't even notice it." I forced a chuckle. "Probably just shifted on its own." She nodded, already half distracted, and I let it go. But a strange unease settled in my chest. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing things. Not loud, obvious noises, just the faintest creaks, like something shifting underneath us. At one point, Anna stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded, even though I wasn't sure if she could see me in the dark. "Just the house settling," I said, though I didn't believe it. Eventually, the sound stopped, and exhaustion won out. Morning came, and for a while, everything felt normal again. We spent the day hiking and exploring, trying to ignore the lingering unease from the night before. When we got back, I checked the trapdoor again. Still shut. I told myself we'd just been imagining things, that our minds were playing tricks on us in the silence of the woods. That night, I locked every door and window before we went to bed. At around 3 a.m., I woke up again. I don't know what roused me this time, but something felt wrong. The room was dead silent. Not even the usual creaks of the old wood. Then, in the stillness, I heard it. Breathing. Slow. Deep. Coming from below. For a few seconds, I froze, heart pounding. Then I carefully, slowly, reached over and shook Anna awake. She stirred groggily. "What?" I put a finger to my lips. "Listen," I whispered. She held still, and the moment stretched on in heavy silence. Then, a faint, deliberate exhale. She stiffened beside me. We weren't imagining it. We didn't sleep the rest of the night. At dawn, we packed our bags as fast as we could. I didn't check the trapdoor again. I didn't want to know. We left within the hour. As soon as we reached a town with service, I called the number in the guest book. An older man answered. I told him about the noises, about the breathing, about the trapdoor being open. There was a long silence. Then he sighed. "Yeah," he said. "I keep sealing that damn thing, but it always gets opened again." I swallowed hard. "What do you mean?" Another pause. Then, "You're not the first to tell me that. I don't know who, or what, was under that cabin. I don't know if it was just some squatter, someone using the crawl space as shelter, or if it was something worse. All I know is, I'll never stay in another remote cabin again." 2 years ago, my brother and I decided to take a camping trip deep in the remote forests of Oregon. We wanted to get away from the usual crowded campsites, away from people, away from noise. Just a few days of isolation, fishing, and hiking. Nothing but us, nature, and the wilderness. We planned carefully, bringing enough food, water, and supplies for 3 days. My brother, Chris, was more experienced in the outdoors than I was. He had been hiking and camping for years, even did some solo trips. I, on the other hand, was more of a casual camper. I liked the experience, but I never strayed too far from official trails or campsites. This trip would be my first time truly off the grid. We parked the truck at the edge of a rough dirt road, the last place vehicles could go before the forest swallowed everything. From there, it was a long hike in, about 6 miles, to a spot Chris had found on a satellite map. He said there was a clearing with a water source nearby, the perfect place to set up. The hike was brutal. The Oregon wilderness was thick with underbrush, fallen trees, and steep inclines that made every step a challenge. The deeper we went, the more we realized how completely alone we were. No signs of people, no trails, no footprints, nothing. Just endless trees and the sound of wind rustling through the branches. After about 4 hours of hiking, the terrain finally leveled out. That's when we saw it, the cabin. It sat in the middle of a clearing, old and weathered. The wood was darkened with age, the roof sagging slightly. It wasn't a large cabin, just a simple one-room structure, probably built decades ago. There were no lights, no signs of recent use. The windows were filthy, covered in dust and grime, and the front door was slightly ajar. Chris and I exchanged a look. We hadn't expected to find something like this out here. "Think anyone lives here?" I asked. Chris shook his head. "Not likely. Look at it. That place hasn't been maintained in years." Still, I felt uneasy. There was something about the cabin that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that it looked abandoned. It was the feeling it gave off, like it didn't want us there. Chris, being the more adventurous one, walked right up to the door and pushed it open with the end of his boot. It creaked loudly, echoing through the trees. Inside, the cabin was almost empty. Just a few pieces of broken furniture, an old metal stove, and a wooden table covered in dust. The air smelled stale, like damp wood and rot. "No sign of squatters," Chris said, stepping inside. "Looks like no one's been here in a long time." I stayed by the doorway, peering in but not stepping inside. Something about it felt wrong, like we were trespassing on something we shouldn't be. "We should set up camp outside," I said, "away from the cabin." Chris shrugged. "Fine by me. We picked a spot about 50 yards away, near the tree line, close enough to the cabin to keep an eye on it, but far enough that I felt a little more comfortable. We set up our tent, built a small fire, and cooked dinner as the sun started to set. For a while, everything felt normal. Peaceful, even. We sat by the fire, talking about random things, work, relationships, old camping trips. The forest around us was quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or distant hoot of an owl. But as night fell, that uneasy feeling crept back in. It started around midnight. I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Someone, or something, was walking just outside our tent. At first, I thought it was Chris, but when I turned over, I saw him still lying in his sleeping bag. His breathing was steady, deep. He was asleep. I held my breath, listening. The footsteps circled our tent, moving slowly, carefully. Not an animal. Too heavy, too purposeful. Then they stopped. Silence. I stayed completely still, heart pounding. I wanted to wake Chris, but I was too afraid to move. Then I heard it, the sound of the cabin door creaking open. I felt cold all over. The door had been shut when we left it. I lay there, frozen, straining to hear. A few moments passed, then nothing. Just the wind outside. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to close my eyes and willed myself to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to Chris shaking my shoulder. "Dude," he said, his voice low. "Look at the cabin." I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and followed his gaze. The door to the cabin was wide open. "I shut it last night," Chris said. I needed a break from everything. Work, people, the constant noise of the city. I had always liked the idea of being alone in nature, away from the stress of everyday life. So, I rented a small cabin deep in the Montana woods for a quiet, week-long writing retreat. It was exactly what I needed. The cabin was in the middle of nowhere. There were no other houses nearby, no cell service, no Wi-Fi, just trees stretching out in every direction. The nearest town was over an hour away. The rental listing had described it as perfect for a peaceful getaway. That was exactly what I wanted. The owner, a man named Robert, met me at the edge of a long dirt road to give me the keys. He was in his late 50s, with a weathered face and rough hands. "Hope you like the quiet," he said with a small smile. I assured him that I did. "There's a radio in the cabin if you need to call for help," he added. "It's old, but it works. Other than that, you're on your own out here." I nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and nervousness. Being alone in the woods sounded peaceful. I didn't think about the fact that it also meant no help if something went wrong. The cabin was small but cozy. It had a fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and one bedroom with a big window that faced the forest. There was no electricity, but I had brought battery-powered lanterns and plenty of food. I planned to spend my time writing, reading, and enjoying the silence. For the first few hours, everything was perfect. I made myself some tea, sat by the window, and started working on my book. The sound of the wind rustling through the trees was relaxing. The sun set early, and by 8 p.m., the forest outside was completely dark. I locked the front door and got into bed. I wasn't scared, just aware of how alone I was. There was no noise except for the occasional creaking of the wooden cabin and the distant hoot of an owl. At around 2 a.m., I woke up. Something had pulled me out of my sleep, but I didn't know what. I lay still listening. The cabin was silent. But then, a soft tapping sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I turned my head slowly, my heart pounding. Outside, just beyond the glass, was a dark figure. It was a man. He was standing right outside my bedroom window, facing me. He wasn't moving. He wasn't holding a flashlight. He was just standing there, staring in. For a long moment, I couldn't breathe. Then I moved. I reached for my phone out of instinct, but of course, there was no service. My hands were shaking. The man didn't move. His face was hidden in the shadows, but I could see the outline of his head and shoulders. He was tall, maybe 6 feet or more. Tap, tap. The sound of his fingers lightly hitting the glass. I didn't know what to do. If I ran outside, he could grab me. If I stayed inside, I was trapped. I reached for the flashlight next to my bed and flicked it on, shining it directly at the window. And just like that, he was gone. I didn't hear footsteps. I didn't see where he went. 1 second he was there, and the next, the window was empty. I sat there frozen, my heart beating so hard it hurt. I wanted to believe it had been a dream. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe my tired brain had turned a shadow into a person. but I knew what I had seen. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat up in bed, holding the flashlight, jumping at every small noise outside. By morning, I convinced myself it had been nothing. Maybe some hunter had gotten lost and seen the cabin lights. Maybe it was just a weird, one-time thing. Then, I went outside. That's when I saw the footprints. They were in the dirt, clear as day. Large boot prints. They started at the tree line and led straight to my bedroom window. But there was something worse. The footprints didn't just stop at my window. They circled the entire cabin. Whoever had been outside had walked around the cabin, stopping at every single window. I felt sick. Who had been out here? What did they want? I grabbed my bag, shoved my things inside, and locked the cabin behind me. I didn't even bother checking the radio. I got into my car and drove as fast as I could back to town. I found Robert, the cabin owner, at the gas station and told him everything. He didn't look surprised. "You're not the first," he said, shaking his head. I stared at him. "What do you mean? People keep seeing him." My stomach dropped. "Who?" Robert sighed. "We don't know." He went on to explain that other renters had seen the same figure over the years, a tall man standing outside at night watching. Some people had heard tapping on the windows. Others had found footprints circling the cabin, just like I had. But no one had ever caught him. No one knew who he was. The police had come out before, but never found anything. "They think it's just some drifter passing through," Robert said. "But it's been happening for years." I didn't care who it was. I just knew I was never coming back. I drove straight home, not stopping until I was hours away from that place. To this day, I still don't know who that man was. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I remember the sound. Tap, tap, and I wonder if he's still out there, standing in the dark, watching. Work was stressing me out, my apartment felt too small, and I just wanted some peace and quiet. So, I booked a cabin in the Adirondacks for a weekend. It was supposed to be a simple, relaxing trip, just me, the forest, and a few books. The listing described the cabin as cozy and rustic, perfect for a quiet retreat. It was owned by an older man named Henry. He was friendly when I arrived, but there was something strange about the way he spoke. "You're gonna love it out here," he said, handing me the key. No noise, no neighbors, just nature. That was exactly what I wanted. As I was about to leave, he hesitated. Then, in a more serious tone, he added, "Oh, one more thing. There's a locked door in the hallway. Don't try to open it." I frowned. "What's inside?" He shook his head. "Just storage. Not important. Just don't bother with it, all right?" I nodded slowly, a little confused, but I didn't ask any more questions. The cabin was small but nice. There was a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a bedroom with a big window facing the trees. I set my bags down and explored the place. Then I saw the door. It was at the end of the hallway, slightly different from the other doors. It was older, with a heavy brass handle. There was no keyhole, just a simple latch that had been locked from the outside. I felt a small chill as I stood there. Something about it felt wrong. I shook off the feeling and reminded myself that it was just a storage room. Nothing weird about that. The rest of the evening was peaceful. I cooked some food, read for a while, and sat by the fireplace, enjoying the quiet. Around 11 p.m., I decided to get some sleep. That's when I heard the first noise. It was soft, almost too quiet to notice at first. A light shuffling sound, like something moving behind the locked door. I froze. I listened carefully, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling. Old cabins made noises sometimes. I forced myself to ignore it, got into bed, and eventually fell asleep. The next day was uneventful. I went for a hike, took some pictures, and spent most of the afternoon reading outside on the porch. But in the back of my mind, I kept thinking about the locked door. By the time night fell, I had convinced myself that I needed to check it. Maybe just knock. Just to prove to myself that it was really just storage. I stood in front of the door, hesitating. Then I knocked. At first, there was nothing. Just silence. Then, from the other side, knock, knock. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. It had been faint, almost like an echo of my own knock. But I knew what I had heard. I backed away slowly, trying to breathe. Maybe there's an animal trapped inside, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon or a stray cat got in somehow. I considered calling Henry, but I had no cell service. The only way to reach him was to drive back to town, and I wasn't about to leave the cabin in the middle of the night. I decided to wait until morning. I went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. Every time I started to drift off, I imagined something standing behind that door listening. By morning, I was feeling ridiculous. It was just a locked room. There was no reason to be afraid of a door. But something about it didn't sit right with me. I went outside to check the exterior of the cabin, looking for a window or any sign of another entrance to the locked room. But there was nothing. The room didn't have a window. From the outside, it didn't even seem like there should be a room there at all. The cabin was too small for an extra space. That didn't make sense. I spent most of the day trying to ignore my growing anxiety. I read, cooked dinner, and tried to act normal. By the time night came, I had made a decision. I was going to open the door. It was almost midnight when I finally stood in front of it. I took a deep breath, placed my hand on the latch, and pulled. It didn't open. The latch was locked tight. I hesitated, then pushed harder. Still locked. I needed something to force it open. I grabbed a screwdriver from my bag and wedged it into the gap between the door and the frame. I twisted, trying to loosen the latch. Then, suddenly, click, the latch popped loose. The door creaked open. I held my breath and reached for my flashlight, shining it into the dark space beyond. The room was empty. No furniture. No boxes. Just bare wooden walls and a single chair in the middle of the floor. The air inside was cold. Stale. Like no one had been inside for years. And then I saw it. The scratches. All over the inside of the door, deep, uneven scratches. Like someone had been clawing at it from the inside. A chill ran through me. Then I noticed something even worse. The latch, the one that had been locked from the outside. There was another one on the inside. Someone had been locked in this room before, and they had tried to get out. I felt sick. I backed away, my flashlight shaking in my hand. I had to get out of there. I turned, and the door slammed shut. I lunged for the handle, pulling as hard as I could. It wouldn't budge. I banged on the door. Let me out. Silence. Then, soft shuffling sounds. Not outside. Inside the room with me. I spun around, my flashlight flickering. The beam landed on the chair. And then, it moved. Just a little. Just enough. I felt a wave of cold rush through me, like something was standing right next to me, watching. I threw myself against the door, screaming, "Let me out!" The light in my flashlight flickered again. And then, click, the door swung open. I stumbled out, gasping for air. The hallway was empty. I grabbed my keys, my bag, and ran out of the cabin. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, speeding away down the dark road. I didn't tell Henry what happened. I just texted him, saying something came up and I had to leave early. He didn't ask any questions. But I still think about that room. Why was it locked? Who had been inside? And most importantly, who closed the door behind me? There is something unsettling about being alone in an unfamiliar place, especially when that place is deep in the woods. That feeling was with me the entire weekend I spent at a remote cabin, miles away from the nearest town. I had gone there to clear my mind, to escape from the stress of my everyday life. But what was supposed to be a peaceful retreat turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. I never saw the person watching me, but I know they were there. I arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The sun was starting to set behind the trees, casting long shadows over the dirt road. The cabin itself was small and old, with a wooden porch and a stone chimney. It looked exactly like the pictures in the listing, isolated, surrounded by nothing but thick forest. I had rented it online from an older couple who lived in a town about an hour away. They had been friendly in their emails, giving me directions and assuring me that the cabin was the perfect place for some peace and quiet. That was exactly what I wanted. I parked my car and carried my bags inside. The inside of the cabin was simple, just one bedroom, a small kitchen, and a cozy living room with a fireplace. There were no neighbors, no cell service, and no distractions. Just the forest and me. Or so I thought. I spent the first evening settling in. I made dinner, read a book, and sat by the fireplace, enjoying the warmth. Outside, the woods were silent except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. At around 11 p.m., I decided to get some sleep. I locked the doors, turned off the lights, and climbed into bed. The cabin was quiet, almost too quiet. Then, in the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. The cabin was still silent. No strange noises, no movement. But something felt off. Then I noticed it. The curtain. The bedroom had a single window, covered by a thin white curtain, and in the dim light of the moon, I could see it moving. Just slightly. Just enough to make my stomach drop. It was as if someone had just pulled it back, just a little, before letting it fall back into place. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. I stared at the window, barely breathing. Nothing happened. No sound. No movement. I told myself it was the wind. The windows weren't the best quality. Maybe a draft had blown the curtain. I forced myself to lie back down, but it took me a long time to fall asleep. The next morning, I checked outside the cabin. I half expected to find footprints in the dirt beneath my window, but there was nothing. Just fallen leaves and twigs. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I spent most of the day hiking through the woods, trying to distract myself. The fresh air helped a little, but by the time I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, the feeling of being watched had returned. That night, as I was sitting on the couch reading, I heard something outside. A soft crunching sound. Footsteps. I froze, my heart pounding. I turned off the lamp, sitting completely still in the darkness. The footsteps stopped. I sat there for what felt like hours, listening, but there was nothing. Finally, I convinced myself it had been an animal. A deer, maybe. Something harmless. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I went to bed around midnight, but I didn't sleep well. Every sound outside made me tense up. Every shift of the wind against the trees made me think someone was moving outside. Then, sometime in the early hours of the morning, I woke up again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The curtain was moving. Not from the wind. Not from a draft. Someone was outside the window. I couldn't see them, but I knew. I could feel it. I stayed completely still, my breath caught in my throat. Then a shadow. For just a second, I saw it through the thin fabric of the curtain. A dark shape. A person. Standing right outside my window. I sat up quickly, reaching for my phone, only to remember that I had no service. I had never felt so helpless in my life. I wanted to run, to turn on every light and scare them away. But my body refused to move. I just sat there, frozen, staring at the curtain. Then, slowly, the shadow moved away. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. As soon as the sun came up, I forced myself to go outside and check around the cabin. I didn't really want to, but I needed to know. The ground beneath my window was disturbed. The dirt and leaves had been moved around, like someone had been standing there. My stomach twisted. I walked around to the back of the cabin and found something worse. The back door, the one I hadn't used since arriving, was unlocked. No, not just unlocked. Slightly open. I felt sick. Had I forgotten to lock it? No. I was sure I had, which meant someone had been inside. While I was sleeping, I didn't bother packing my things. I grabbed my car keys, ran to my car, and sped away from that cabin as fast as I could. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, sitting in a crowded gas station parking lot, trying to calm my breathing. I called the owners from a payphone. I didn't tell them everything. I just said something had come up, and I had to leave early. They didn't seem surprised. I didn't ask why. I never went back to that cabin. And to this day, I still wonder, who was outside my window that night? And worse, were they ever inside the cabin with me? I don't think I'll ever go back to a cabin in the woods again. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. 3 days away from the noise of the city, a chance to clear my head and reset. I had rented a remote cabin online, somewhere deep in the mountains, far from any major roads or towns. The listing described it as the perfect escape for those who crave solitude. That's exactly what I had wanted. But I wasn't alone. Someone had been there before me, and they left something behind. The drive to the cabin was long and exhausting. The last 2 hours of the trip were spent on winding dirt roads that snaked through the dense forest. There were no other houses, no signs of civilization, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. The cabin itself was small and simple, made of old wood, with a stone chimney and a porch that creaked under my weight. It looked untouched, like no one had been there in years. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and headed inside. The air was thick with the smell of aged wood and dust. Everything was as expected. A small living room, a kitchen with outdated appliances, a single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom. I should have felt relieved to finally be there. But something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious. just a slight unease creeping into my chest, like the air in the cabin was too still. I shook it off. I was just tired from the drive. At least, that's what I told myself. That first night, I made a simple dinner, read a book by the fireplace, and went to bed early. The silence of the forest was strangely comforting. No sirens, no traffic, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I fell asleep easily. But when I woke up the next morning, I noticed something strange. There was a piece of paper on the floor near the front door. A small, folded note. I frowned, picking it up. Had I dropped it? I didn't remember bringing any paper with me. I unfolded it, my heartbeat quickening as I read the shaky, handwritten words. "You're not alone." My skin went cold. I looked around the cabin, half expecting someone to be standing there, watching me. But there was no one. The door was locked. The windows were closed. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank. Maybe the owners had left it behind as a joke. Maybe it had been tucked into an old book and had fallen out. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Someone had put it there. Someone had been in the cabin. I spent the rest of the morning checking the cabin, looking for any signs that someone had broken in. But the windows were intact. The doors were locked. There was no sign of forced entry. Still, the unease lingered. I tried to ignore it, spending the day hiking through the woods. The fresh air helped clear my mind, and by the time I got back to the cabin in the late afternoon, I convinced myself I had overreacted. But then I noticed something else. Something small. The chair in the living room had been moved. It was subtle, just slightly angled differently than before. But I knew I hadn't touched it. Had someone been inside while I was gone? I checked the door again. Still locked. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been here. Someone was watching me. That night, I locked every door, double-checked the windows, and kept a flashlight beside my bed. I barely slept. Every creak, every whisper of wind against the cabin made my heart pound. But nothing happened. No strange noises. No movement outside. When the sun finally rose, I let out a breath of relief. Then I saw it. Another piece of paper. It was sitting on the kitchen counter. I hadn't put it there. My hands trembled as I unfolded it, my stomach twisting as I read the words. "Don't look outside." My breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to, but I had to. I moved slowly toward the window, my pulse hammering in my ears. I peered out, expecting to see something. But there was nothing, just the empty forest. At least, that's what I thought, until I noticed it. A single footprint in the dirt, right outside the window. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to get out of there. But it was late, and the nearest town was hours away. Driving through those dark, winding forest roads at night didn't seem any safer. So I stayed, but I didn't sleep. I sat in bed, gripping a flashlight, listening to every sound outside. Sometime past midnight, I heard it. A soft tapping. It was faint, barely there. But I knew exactly where it was coming from. The window. The one right beside my bed. I held my breath, my grip tightening around the flashlight. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone was testing to see if I'd react. I didn't move. Then silence. The tapping stopped. I lay there, frozen, waiting for something else to happen. But nothing did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted off. When I woke up, the first thing I saw was the third note. It was sitting on the nightstand beside my bed. "I saw you." I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, my keys, and practically ran out of the cabin. I didn't care about packing up properly. I didn't care about leaving the place a mess. I just needed to get out. As I started my car, I stole one last glance at the cabin. That's when I saw it. In the dirt near the porch was a fourth note. It was folded neatly, placed right where I would see it before leaving. I knew I shouldn't, but I had to. I got out of the car, heart pounding, and picked up the note with shaking hands. I unfolded it, my stomach twisting into knots as I read the final message. "See you soon." I never looked back. I sped down the dirt roads, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. I checked into a motel, locked the door, and barely slept that night. The next morning, I called the owners of the cabin. I told them something had happened, but I didn't go into detail. I just said I wouldn't be staying the full 3 days. They didn't sound surprised. I asked if anyone else had keys to the cabin, if someone could have been inside while I was there. The owner was silent for a moment. Then he sighed and said, "You're not the first person to leave early." I asked what he meant. He hesitated before saying, Someone keeps leaving notes, but we've never caught them. I felt sick. I asked why they still rented the place out if they knew something was wrong. We need the money, he said simply. That was the last time I spoke to him. I never went back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still think about that last note. See you soon. I don't know who left those notes. I don't know if they followed me. But I still wake up sometimes, feeling like I'm being watched. I should have turned back. From the very first moment I stepped into that cabin, something felt wrong. It was supposed to be a simple trip. A weekend in the mountains, away from the city, away from work, away from stress. I booked a cabin online, just a small, rustic place near a lake. No TV, no Wi-Fi, just peace and quiet. But I made a mistake. A small one. A simple mix-up. I went to the wrong cabin, and someone else knew I was there. The drive up the mountain was long and slow. The roads were winding, barely wide enough for one car, and the deeper I went into the forest, the fewer signs of civilization I saw. By the time I reached the area where the cabin was supposed to be, it was almost dark. I checked my phone for the directions one last time, but there was no signal, no GPS, just a vague description of where the cabin was located. I followed the dirt road until I spotted it, a small, weathered wooden cabin tucked between the trees. A single porch light flickered weakly. That had to be it. I parked, grabbed my bag, and made my way to the front door. The cabin looked exactly like the pictures, old but sturdy, with a simple porch and a stone chimney. I found the key where the owner said it would be, under a loose plank on the porch. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, I felt a wave of relief. I had made it, or so I thought. The inside of the cabin was basic. One small room with a bed, a table, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen area. There was a door that led to the bathroom and another leading to a storage closet. Everything seemed fine. At first, I set my bag down, took a deep breath, and looked around. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The floors creaked under my weight as I walked toward the small table near the fireplace. That's when I noticed it. A mug. It was sitting on the table, still half full of coffee. The liquid was dark and still, but something about it made my stomach twist. I hadn't made coffee. Had the last guest forgotten to clean up? Maybe the owner had been here earlier? I reached out, touching the side of the mug. It was warm. Someone had been here. Recently. I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe the owner had come to check on the place before I arrived. Maybe they had made coffee and left without finishing it. I tried to ignore the unease creeping into my chest. But then I noticed something else. The bed was messy. The blankets were rumpled, the pillows slightly indented, like someone had been lying there. I stood frozen in place, staring at the unmade bed. The listing had said the cabin would be clean and ready for my arrival. But this wasn't clean. This wasn't ready. This looked like someone had just been here. Maybe they still were. I turned around, my heart pounding. The cabin was silent. Too silent. I forced myself to check the bathroom. It was empty. The closet? Also empty. I let out a breath, laughing at myself. I was being paranoid. It was just an old cabin. Maybe the owner forgot to tidy up after the last guest. I decided to settle in. I unpacked a few things, made a small dinner, and tried to relax. But the feeling never left me. And later that night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. Footsteps. Soft. Slow. Right outside the cabin. I held my breath, my body going stiff. The footsteps moved along the porch, creaking the wooden planks. Someone was out there. I stayed completely still, my heart thudding against my ribs. Then silence. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it was an animal? A deer or a raccoon. I kept telling myself that over and over, until I finally drifted into an uneasy sleep. I woke up at dawn, exhausted and tense. The cabin was cold, the fire having burned out during the night. I got up, rubbing my arms, and walked to the front door to check outside. And then I froze. The door was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it the night before. My hands trembled as I slowly turned the knob. The door creaked open, revealing the empty porch. The forest was still, bathed in pale morning light. But something was different. The doormat had been moved. It was supposed to be centered in front of the door, but now it was shifted to the side, like someone had stepped on it, or lifted it. A chill ran down my spine. I crouched down and slowly lifted the mat. Underneath it was a single key. Not the one I had used. This one was old and rusted. It hadn't been there the day before. I stood up quickly, my breath shaky. Someone had been here. Someone had been inside. And they had left a key. But why? I couldn't stay. I grabbed my things and rushed to my car. I didn't even care about breakfast. I just needed to get out. As I started driving, my phone finally got a signal. Messages flooded in, one from the owner of the cabin I had actually rented. It read, "Hey, just checking in. Haven't heard from you. Are you okay? You never arrived at the cabin." I felt my stomach drop. I pulled over, my hands shaking, and checked the booking details again. And then I saw it. I had gone to the wrong cabin. My cabin was 2 miles down the road. I had spent the entire night in someone else's home. But if the cabin wasn't a rental, then whose coffee had that been? Whose bed had I slept in? And most importantly, who had been watching me? I didn't go back. I didn't check out the real cabin. I just drove straight home, shaking the entire way. I called the rental owner later and apologized, making up an excuse about car trouble. Then I asked them, casually, if they knew anything about the other cabin up the road. There was a pause. Then the owner said, "There's no other cabin." I felt the blood drain from my face. I insisted the cabin was there. I had stayed in it. Another pause. Then, in a quiet voice, the owner said, "That cabin burned down 10 years ago." I hung up the phone. I never went back. I don't know whose cabin I stayed in. I don't know who was watching me. And I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed another night. I needed a break. Life had been exhausting, work stress, personal issues, and the constant noise of the city. I wanted nothing more than to get away from it all, even if just for a few days. That's why I booked a small, isolated cabin deep in the woods. It was perfect. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and silence. I packed my car with enough food and supplies for 3 nights and hit the road early in the morning. The drive was long, but as I left the highways behind and entered the dense forest, I felt relieved. The air smelled fresh, the trees stood tall, and the world finally felt peaceful. I had no idea that by the end of the trip, I would be praying for noise. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already beginning to set. The dirt road leading up to it was rough, with deep potholes and overgrown weeds. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy, small, wooden, with a covered porch and a chimney on the side. I parked my car, grabbed my bags, and walked up to the front door. The key was exactly where the owner said it would be, under a loose brick on the porch. Unlocking the door, I stepped inside and took a deep breath. The inside was simple: one large room with a bed, a small kitchen, a wooden table, and a fireplace. A single door led to the bathroom, and another to a storage closet. Everything seemed normal. I put my bags down, lit a few candles since there was no electricity, and started a fire in the fireplace. The warmth filled the room quickly, and for the first time in months, I felt relaxed. But that feeling didn't last long. After eating a simple dinner, I settled into bed with a book. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional creak of the wooden walls as the temperature outside dropped. At some point, I fell asleep, and that's when I heard it: laughter. I woke up instantly, my heart racing. The room was dark except for the dim glow of the dying fire. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. Then I heard it again. Soft, childlike. It came from outside the cabin. I sat up in bed, straining my ears. The laughter was distant but clear, echoing through the trees. It didn't sound like a normal, happy laugh. It was slow, unnatural, like someone pretending to be a child. My stomach twisted. There was no reason for a child to be out here, in the middle of the forest, in the dead of night. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated. Did I really want to look outside? The laughter stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I convinced myself it was the wind or some kind of animal. Maybe even a trick of my own tired mind. I lay back down, keeping the flashlight close, and somehow managed to fall asleep again. The next day, I woke up feeling uneasy. The laughter from the night before still haunted me, but in the daylight, it felt less terrifying. I stepped outside to get some fresh air, hoping the sunlight would help me shake off the fear. That's when I saw them. Footprints. Small ones like those of a child. They led from the edge of the forest to my cabin porch. And then they stopped. There were no footprints leading away. Whoever, or whatever, had walked up to my cabin last night never left. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I told myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. Maybe an animal? Maybe the prints were old. Maybe I had simply not noticed them when I arrived. I forced myself to ignore the fear creeping into my chest. I spent the day hiking and trying to clear my mind. By the time I returned, the sun was already setting. I told myself tonight would be different. I was wrong. I locked the door. I bolted the windows. I sat by the fireplace, listening to the silence, waiting. For hours, nothing happened. And then, the laughter came back. This time, it was closer. Right outside the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands shaking. My heart pounded as I stood up and slowly walked to the window. I took a deep breath and shined the light outside. Nothing. The porch was empty. The trees were still. But the moment I turned the flashlight off, the laughter started again. Right by the window. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. Something was out there, watching me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, wide-eyed, waiting for the morning. The laughter didn't stop until just before dawn. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But my pride, my stupid, stubborn pride, kept me there. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I was overreacting. I decided to stay one more night. That was the biggest mistake of my life. As the sun set, I locked myself inside, armed with a kitchen knife. The fire burned brightly, casting long shadows across the cabin walls. Then the knocking started. Soft taps, coming from the front door. I held my breath, gripping the knife tighter. Then the back window. Knock, knock, knock. Then the closet door inside the cabin. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. Something was inside with me. The closet door was closed, just as it had been all day. But now, I wasn't sure. Had I checked it earlier? Had it always been slightly open? I took a step closer. The fire crackled behind me. My own breathing sounded too loud. I reached for the doorknob, my fingers trembling. Then, the laughter exploded from inside. I screamed, stumbling backward. The door didn't move. Nothing came out. But the laughter kept going. Louder, shrill, twisted. I ran. I grabbed my keys, flung open the front door, and sprinted to my car. As I fumbled to unlock it, I risked one last glance at the cabin. And that's when I saw it. Through the window, staring at me from inside the cabin, a small, pale face. A child, smiling, still laughing. I don't remember much after that. I sped down the dark road, barely able to see through my tears. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I checked into a motel and locked myself in the bathroom, shaking uncontrollably. The next day, I called the owner and told him I had left early. I didn't explain why. I never told anyone what happened. But sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I swear I can still hear it. That horrible, twisted laughter. And I always wonder, what would have happened if I had opened the closet? I needed some time alone. Life had been overwhelming. Work stress, personal problems, and the constant noise of the city. My friend Mark told me about a cabin he had rented before, deep in the woods, perfect for relaxing. It's quiet, private, and no one goes out there, he said. You'll love it. That was exactly what I needed. I booked the cabin for the weekend, packed my bags, and drove out early Friday morning. The drive was peaceful at first, long roads surrounded by trees, no traffic, no distractions. As I got closer, the paved roads turned into dirt paths, and my phone lost signal. It felt good to be disconnected. But as I got closer to the cabin, something felt off. The cabin looked just like the pictures, small, wooden, with a porch and a chimney on the side. It was surrounded by tall trees, and there were no other houses nearby. But something felt strange. The front door was unlocked. I hesitated. Maybe the cleaning crew forgot to lock it after the last guest? I pushed the door open slowly and stepped inside. The cabin was simple. One big room with a bed, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a door leading to the bathroom. A closet sat in the corner. Everything looked clean, but there was a strange smell in the air. Like something old. Stale. I shook it off and brought my bags inside. I checked the cabin. Windows locked, bathroom empty, closet empty. I was alone. At least, I thought I was. That evening, I made dinner, started a fire, and settled in with a book. The cabin was quiet, except for the occasional creak of the wooden walls. By midnight, I was exhausted. I locked the front door, checked the windows again, and went to bed. I woke up suddenly. Something was different. The fire was out. The room was colder. And then I heard it. A soft shuffle, like footsteps. Inside the cabin, I held my breath. My heart pounded in my chest. I reached for my flashlight, slowly turning it on. The room was empty. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe the wood was just settling. I forced myself to close my eyes. And then, the sound came again. A quiet movement. A shift of weight. But this time, it came from the closet. I stared at the closed door, my stomach twisting in fear. Had I checked inside before bed? Had the door been open or closed earlier? I pulled the blanket up and forced myself to stay still. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I told myself I had imagined it. I got up, made coffee, and walked around the cabin, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet door was open, just a few inches. I knew I had closed it the night before. Hadn't I? I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly toward the closet. I took a deep breath, grabbed the handle, and yanked the door open. Nothing. Just an empty space with some old shelves. I exhaled in relief. Maybe the door was loose. Maybe the wind had pushed it open. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't really alone. That evening, I tried to relax. I played some music, cooked a nice meal, and told myself I was just overthinking things. By the time I got into bed, I felt a little better. But that didn't last long. At exactly midnight, I woke up again. This time, it wasn't footsteps. It was breathing. Soft. Shallow. Coming from inside the room. I gripped my flashlight with shaking hands and turned it on. The room looked the same. Except, the closet door was open again. Wider this time. I stared at it, my heart slamming against my ribs. Someone was in here. I forced myself to move. I got out of bed, walked to the closet, and shut the door hard. Then I dragged the heavy wooden chair from the kitchen and wedged it under the doorknob. If something was inside, it wasn't coming out now. I sat awake for hours, gripping the flashlight. Waiting. Listening. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the sun was rising. The chair was still under the doorknob. The closet was still shut. Had I imagined it all? I wanted to believe that, until I looked at the floor and saw the footprints. Small, border, leading from the closet to my bed. I should have left right then, but I didn't. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Maybe the footprints had been there before, and I just hadn't noticed. I spent the day outside, hiking near the cabin, trying to distract myself. But no matter how far I walked, I felt like I was being watched, like something was waiting for me to come back. When the sun started to set, my stomach twisted. I did not want to go back inside. But where else could I go? That night, I didn't even try to sleep. I locked the door, bolted the windows, and sat by the fire with my flashlight and knife in hand, waiting. Midnight came. The fire crackled. The wind howled outside. And then, a single knock. Not at the front door. At the closet. My breath caught in my throat. I couldn't move. The knock came again. Then the handle twisted. I grabbed the chair and pushed it harder against the door. The handle rattled, harder this time. Something wanted out. Then, silence. The air in the cabin felt heavy. Thick. Like something was waiting. Then, a whisper. Soft. Close. Let me out. I ran. I grabbed my keys, flung open the front door, and sprinted to my car. As I fumbled with the lock, I dared to look back. Through the window, behind the glass. A shadow. Tall. Watching me. Smiling. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I jumped in my car and sped away, never looking back. The next day, I called Mark and told him what happened. He went silent. Then he said, "I never told you this, but I only stayed one night when I rented that cabin." "Why?" I asked. He took a deep breath. "I woke up to the closet door open. Neither of us ever went back. And sometimes late at night I wonder, what would have happened if I had let it out?" I had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. My friend Alex had invited me to stay at his family's old hunting cabin deep in the woods. He and his brother had planned a weekend of fishing, grilling, and just getting away from city life. It sounded perfect. The drive took hours. As we got closer, the roads became narrow, winding through thick forests. There were no streetlights, no houses, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was already setting. It was a small, simple wooden structure with a tin roof and a front porch. There was a single dirt road leading to it, and beyond that, nothing but wilderness. I felt a slight unease as I stepped out of the car. Something about the place felt wrong, but I ignored it. This was just a cabin, nothing more. Inside, the cabin was cozy but old. Wooden walls, a stone fireplace, and a few worn-out couches. The kitchen was small, and there were only 2 bedrooms. We unpacked, made some food, and spent the evening playing cards and drinking beer. Everything was fine, until I stepped outside to get some fresh air. That's when I saw it. Blood. A single red smear on the front door. My stomach tightened. I reached out and touched it. It was dry, dark, and looked like it had been there for a while. "Hey, Alex," I called. "Did you see this?" He came over, frowning. "What?" I pointed at the stain. His face changed. For a moment, he looked uneasy. Then he forced a chuckle. "Oh, that? It's probably from when my dad and uncle hunted here last fall. They skinned a deer out front." I nodded slowly, but something felt off. Why would someone wipe animal blood on the door? I tried to forget about it. We went back inside, had a few more drinks, and eventually Alex's brother, Matt, went to bed. Alex and I stayed up talking for a while. The fire crackled, and the woods outside were completely silent. Then, a knock. It was faint, almost too soft to hear. We both froze. Knock, knock, knock. I turned to Alex. His face had gone pale. "It's probably Matt messing with us," he said, standing up. He walked to the door and swung it open. No one was there. The trees stood still, the dirt road was empty, and the night air was freezing. Alex cursed under his breath and closed the door. "Probably the wind," he muttered, forcing a smile. I didn't believe him. I went to bed feeling uneasy. The bedroom was small, with an old wooden bed and a single window looking out into the trees. The wind howled outside, rattling the thin walls of the cabin. I tried to sleep. Then, a sound, a low scraping noise, like something dragging against the wood outside. I held my breath. The noise moved, slow and deliberate, from one side of the cabin to the other. I sat up, heart pounding. Footsteps. Light, slow, circling the cabin. I reached for my phone, no signal. The time read 3:12 a.m. I listened, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped right outside my window. I didn't move. I didn't dare look. For a long time, there was only silence. Then, a long, slow tap against the glass. Tap, tap, tap. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay still. The tapping stopped. The footsteps moved away. Then nothing. I stayed awake until morning. When the sun finally rose, I stepped outside. My stomach dropped. On the cabin door, right where the old bloodstain had been, a fresh, bloody handprint. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "Alex!" I shouted. He ran outside, saw what I was pointing at, and froze. "That," he started but stopped. The blood was still wet. He turned and ran toward Matt's room, throwing the door open. Matt was still asleep. Alive. Safe. Which meant someone else had been here. And they had been right outside my window last night. We spent the morning searching the area. No footprints. No signs of anyone. It didn't make sense. But something else was wrong. One of the knives from the kitchen was missing. Alex swore he had left it on the counter the night before. Now it was gone. I felt sick. Someone had been inside the cabin, watching us. We had to leave. But Matt was still half asleep, insisting we were overreacting. So we stayed. Big mistake. By the time the sun set, I was on edge. I locked every door and window, made sure the fireplace was burning bright, and kept a kitchen knife beside my bed. But none of it made me feel safe. At exactly midnight, I heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. Soft, slow, right on the window beside my bed. I clenched my jaw. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't show fear. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, aiming it at the window. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I let out a shaky breath. Then, the closet door behind me creaked open. I spun around, my heart nearly stopping. The closet was empty, but something felt wrong, like I wasn't alone. I reached for the doorknob, and then, outside the window, something moved. Just a shadow. Tall. Watching. I didn't move. I just stared, my hands gripping the knife. For a long time, the shadow didn't move either. Then, it grinned. Not a person. Not a trick of the light. A mouth. Too wide. Too sharp. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair. The shadow moved fast, too fast. And then it was gone. I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, stormed into the other room, and yelled, "We're leaving." Now, Alex and Matt saw my face and didn't argue. We grabbed our things, ran to the truck, and threw everything inside. As Alex turned the key, I risked one last glance at the cabin. Something was standing on the porch, watching us. Tall, thin, face stretched into that same awful grin. But the worst part, it was holding the missing knife. Alex slammed the gas pedal, and we tore down the dirt road, not stopping until we hit the main highway. We never went back. Alex's family put the cabin up for sale, but no one bought it. A year later, a storm knocked it down. But sometimes I still dream about that place. And in those dreams, I see the door, and the blood on it, and I hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend getaway, the kind of break I needed after weeks of work stress. I was tired, drained, and desperate for some solitude. Maggie, my old college friend, had been planning the trip for months. Her family owned a cabin in the woods just outside the small town of Pine Ridge, and she'd invited me to come with her. The idea of escaping the hustle of city life for a few days in the middle of nature seemed like the perfect opportunity to recharge. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the woods, far from any civilization. Maggie said it was the perfect spot to unwind, and that she'd done it many times before. It wasn't fancy, just a small 2-story structure with a stone fireplace and wooden walls. It didn't need to be anything else. When I arrived, Maggie greeted me with a warm hug and a broad smile. She seemed excited to have me there, and I could tell she was looking forward to the break as much as I was. We took her car and drove out of town, the road getting narrower as we went deeper into the forest. Trees crowded on either side, their tall trunks casting shadows over the road. Maggie and I talked the whole way, catching up on life, sharing stories, and laughing about old memories. But the deeper we drove, the more I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't fear exactly, it was just a strange feeling, like something wasn't quite right. "I swear the road gets narrower every time I come here," Maggie said with a nervous laugh. "It's like it's trying to keep us out." I joked, trying to lighten the mood, but the unease stayed with me. We finally arrived at the cabin, just as the sun was setting. It was beautiful in its own way, surrounded by towering trees and the sounds of the wilderness. The only noise was the rustling of leaves in the wind. We unloaded our things and entered the cabin, the smell of old wood and pine filling the air. It was cozy and rustic, with a fireplace in the center of the room and a couple of old couches arranged around it. The day had been long, so we decided to relax with some drinks, listening to music and talking about everything that had happened since we last saw each other. As the night grew darker, we moved to the porch, enjoying the quiet of the woods around us. It was getting late, and the cold night air had started to seep in. The woods outside were silent, the only sounds the occasional chirp of crickets and the distant hoot of an owl. We'd finished our drinks and decided to go inside, but something made me stop for a moment. A noise, a rustle in the trees. I glanced around, but the darkness made it hard to see anything beyond the edge of the porch. It was probably an animal, just the wind, I told myself. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the thought, and went back inside. Maggie was already preparing to go to bed. She yawned and stretched, her tired eyes looking out the window. "I always forget how quiet it gets out here at night," she said softly. "Yeah, it's kind of eerie," I replied. But I didn't mean it in a creepy way, just that the stillness was different from anything I was used to in the city. We turned off the lights, and I climbed into the bed Maggie had set up for me in the guest room. The darkness was thick, pressing against the walls of the cabin. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the night. The wind outside, the occasional creak of the old wood, and something else. A sound, far off in the distance. A soft, eerie whisper, like someone calling my name. I froze, unsure if I'd actually heard it, or if my mind was playing tricks on me. But then it came again, faint but clear. "Help, please." I sat up, heart racing. The voice sounded far away, but close enough that I could have sworn it was right outside the window. I didn't move. I wanted to, but something kept me frozen in place. Was it just the wind, or was someone really out there? After a long moment, I decided to get up and look. I pulled on my jacket and went out to the porch, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. The night was colder now, the woods surrounding the cabin looking even darker than before. "Maggie," I called quietly, but there was no answer. I glanced around the porch, feeling exposed in the open air. The woods were still and silent, the trees towering over the cabin like dark sentinels. I waited a moment longer, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but no voice came back. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like something was watching me. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I told Maggie about the strange voice I'd heard. She just laughed it off, saying it was probably just the wind or my imagination. She was so easygoing, and I envied her ability to brush off strange things like that. But something still nagged at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there, something in the woods. That afternoon, we decided to take a walk. Maggie was excited to show me the nearby lake, a beautiful spot she loved to visit whenever she came up to the cabin. We grabbed our jackets and headed out, following a narrow trail that wound through the trees. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the forest floor. But as we walked deeper into the woods, I started to feel that strange unease again. It wasn't anything I could pinpoint, just a sense that something was off. Maybe it was just the isolation. After all, we were miles away from the nearest neighbor. The trail led us to the lake, a calm, still body of water surrounded by tall trees. The sun glinted off the surface, and I breathed a sigh of relief. For a moment, it was peaceful, and I began to relax. But then Maggie stopped. She looked off into the trees, her expression suddenly serious. "What's wrong?" I asked. She didn't answer at first. Instead, she turned her head, scanning the area. "I thought I saw something," she said slowly. "Over there." I followed her gaze. The trees were dense, the shadows deep, but I couldn't see anything unusual. "Probably just a deer," I said, trying to reassure her. But Maggie was still staring into the woods. "No, it wasn't an animal," she muttered. "I don't know what it was." I felt a chill run down my spine. The atmosphere was different now, and my unease returned in full force. That evening, we sat by the fire in the cabin, the glow of the flames flickering against the walls. We were trying to shake off the weird feeling from earlier, but it wasn't easy. Maggie was unusually quiet, and I could tell she was just as unsettled as I was. Around midnight, we decided to turn in. I was still feeling that nagging sense of dread, but I pushed it aside, convinced it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. I lay in bed, trying to fall asleep, but the silence was suffocating. The wind had died down, and the usual nighttime sounds of the forest were eerily absent. Then I heard it again, the faint whisper. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest. "Help, please." This time, I knew it wasn't the wind. It was too clear, too real. It was coming from somewhere close, just outside the cabin. I jumped out of bed and ran to the window. Through the darkness, I saw a figure standing in the trees. A woman, tall and thin, her face hidden in shadow. She stood still, watching the cabin, her body barely moving. I felt a shiver run down my spine, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, without warning, she began to walk. Slowly, deliberately toward the cabin. I backed away from the window, heart racing. "Maggie," I whispered urgently, but she didn't answer. She was already asleep. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the signal was gone. The silence outside was overwhelming. The woman was still coming closer. I had to get Maggie up. We had to leave. I rushed to her room and shook her awake. "Maggie, wake up. There's someone outside." Her eyes snapped open, and she blinked in confusion. "What are you talking about?" "The woman in the woods," I whispered urgently. "She's right outside." Maggie got out of bed and went to the window. For a moment, I thought she'd see her too. But then she turned back, shaking her head. "There's nothing out there," she said calmly. I couldn't believe it, but the feeling in my gut told me otherwise. The woman was out there, and we weren't alone in the woods anymore. The next morning, we packed up and left. I didn't care what Maggie said about the woman. I couldn't stay there any longer. We drove back to town, both of us silent the whole way, the memory of that figure in the woods haunting me. When we got back to the cabin, Maggie's family was there, and they were confused when we told them what had happened. Maggie laughed it off, trying to convince them it was just our imagination. But I knew what I saw, and as we left Pine Ridge behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway. Just a few days in a secluded cabin, away from the noise of the city and the weight of everyday life. No work emails, no social media notifications, no distractions, just peace and quiet. I had been looking forward to it for weeks. After a hectic few months at the office, I was finally going to spend some quality time alone, surrounded by nature. The cabin was a few hours' drive from the city, nestled deep in the woods, far enough away from civilization to feel truly isolated. When I first arrived, everything seemed perfect. The air was fresh and crisp, the trees towering above the cabin like silent guardians. The cabin itself was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a big leather armchair, and a large window that overlooked the forest. I couldn't wait to start reading my book, sip hot tea, and just unwind. I'd rented the cabin for a few days, expecting it to be a peaceful retreat. The owner of the cabin had warned me about the lack of cell phone service and the spotty internet, but I was relieved by that. I didn't want to be interrupted by calls, emails, or messages. The first night was everything I hoped for. I sat by the fire, reading a mystery novel, the crackling of the logs filling the silence. I cooked a simple dinner, just a pot of soup, and settled in for the night. The cabin creaked in the wind, and the sound of distant branches rustling outside added a touch of eerie charm to the whole experience. It was quiet, almost too quiet, but I didn't mind. It was peaceful. The next day, I woke up early to the sound of birds chirping and the smell of pine in the air. I brewed some coffee and stepped outside, taking in the beauty of the woods. There was a small trail leading into the forest, and I decided to explore it. I spent the morning walking, the only sound the crunching of leaves beneath my boots. As I walked deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't a feeling I could easily explain, just a strange sense of unease that settled over me as I moved further away from the cabin. I turned around a few times to look back, but the cabin was nowhere in sight. I figured it was just my imagination running wild and kept walking. By midday, I had reached a small clearing in the woods. It was a perfect spot to stop and eat the lunch I'd packed. I sat on a large rock, unpacking my sandwich and watching the forest around me. The air was still, and the trees seemed to be holding their breath. I finished my lunch, packed up, and began the walk back to the cabin. That was when I noticed something strange. There was a figure standing at the edge of the clearing. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, but the figure was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes. I froze, unsure of what to do. Was it another hiker? A local? Someone who had lost their way? I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the figure. Then, without any warning, it turned and disappeared into the trees. I didn't know why, but something about it felt wrong. My heart was racing, and I immediately began walking back toward the cabin, my pace quickening as I went. The walk back felt longer than it had earlier, and the strange feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. When I finally reached the cabin, I locked the door behind me, trying to push the unease out of my mind. I didn't want to overthink it. It was probably just someone else enjoying the woods, right? That evening, as the sun began to set, I decided to relax by the fire again. I poured myself a glass of wine and grabbed my book, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the figure in the woods. I tried to distract myself, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Around 9 p.m., the power went out. It wasn't unexpected. The cabin was in a remote location, and power outages were common. I lit a few candles and settled into the armchair, trying to make the best of the situation. The wind was picking up outside, rattling the windows. The silence of the cabin was almost suffocating now, broken only by the occasional gust of wind. Then the phone rang. I froze. The cabin's landline phone had been an old, dusty thing. I hadn't even checked if it worked when I arrived. But now it was ringing, its shrill tone cutting through the silence of the cabin. I hesitated. Who could be calling me out here? I was miles from the nearest town, and there were no neighbors for miles. It was strange, unsettling even. But curiosity got the better of me, and I walked over to the phone, picking up the receiver. "Hello," I said, my voice shaky. There was a pause. Silence on the other end. Then a low, raspy voice came through the line. "Get out of the cabin." I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The voice was soft but chilling, as if it had come from a long distance away. I didn't know who was calling or how they knew I was there, but the command was clear. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. Another pause, then the voice came again, more insistent this time. "Get out now." I looked around the cabin, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. Who would be calling me in the middle of nowhere? And why were they telling me to leave? "Are you still there?" the voice asked, and I could hear the faintest hint of laughter in their tone. "Who are you?" I demanded again, but the line went dead. The phone clicked, and I was left holding the receiver in the silence of the cabin. I stared at the phone, my pulse racing. My mind was running wild with possibilities. Was it some prank? Was someone playing a joke on me? Or was there something more sinister at play? I tried to shake the feeling off, but it was impossible. I had the overwhelming sense that I wasn't alone. Someone was out there, watching me. I spent the rest of the night nervously checking the windows, making sure the doors were locked, and keeping the lights on. The wind howled outside, and the trees creaked, but I couldn't relax. I kept imagining that I heard footsteps, faint rustling noises, just beyond the cabin's walls. Around midnight, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and decided to drive back to the nearest town, even though it would take me hours to get there. I couldn't stay in that cabin, not with the phone call still echoing in my head. I was almost to the door when I heard it. A knock. It was soft at first, but it grew louder and more insistent, coming from the front door. I froze, my heart racing once again. I didn't move. I didn't say a word. The knock came again, followed by a voice. "Open the door." "It's me." It was the same voice from the phone call. But how could that be? I hadn't seen anyone when I checked outside earlier, and the cabin was miles from any other homes or cabins. I felt my legs go weak beneath me. The voice sounded so close now, just outside the door. But I couldn't bring myself to open it. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no sound. No more knocking. No more voice. Just the howling wind outside and the silence within. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every rustle in the trees made my heart race. I sat by the fire, staring into the flames, trying to ignore the dread gnawing at my insides. When the sun finally rose, I gathered my things and left. I didn't care about the cost of the cabin or the rest of my stay. I just needed to get out of there. The drive back to the city was long and exhausting, but I didn't care. I didn't want to be anywhere near that cabin again. To this day, I have no idea who called me that night or why, and I've never been back to that cabin. But I'll never forget the voice. The voice that told me to get out, and the voice that knocked on my door. Whoever, or whatever, it was, I pray I never meet them again.